My Philosophical Ideas 3. Antonio.P. Copyright author, layout, and cover design. Antonio.P. Published in December 2017. Foreword. In this third part of my philosophical ideas, I will try to continue to deepen those aspects that have been pending or recently clarified in my previous books. This book is formed with the collection of articles published on my blog, The Road to the New Era. With these books I try to show that through meditation can break the limitations of the times in which we live and explore time and space. Actually, all the articles in this book represent a greater or lesser extent a philosophical approach to life and the universe, but I considered it appropriate to divide them into four main areas for its greater similarity of content. My books are primarily the result of a search, because in life one can simply believe what they tell and live passively, or take advantage of the creative potential that every living thing has to design a better world. I have chosen the second option. This book has been translated from the original Spanish version. Chapter 1, Medicine. Tips. Insomnia. The first thing to do about insomnia is to understand that our body is a machine that needs to be respected, so we must accept that does not always work as well as we would like, i.e. it is not necessary to resort to drugs ever our body is out of the most desirable guidelines. In a situation of insomnia must understand that in many cases the problem occurs because of a concern. In this case is logical that we cannot sleep, so if that problem requires our attention, it is best to give it and have patience, because in these cases the dream usually back the next day. In any case, if after a few hours of lying is not possible to sleep, it's best to get up and stay a while in an upright position so that the blood down from the head, for long remain awake in horizontal position may cause an increase in blood pressure in the brain with consequent onset of headache, then drink some water may be appropriate for its cooling effect. If after returning to bed insomnia persists, it is best to dress and sitting on a couch to rest, because in this way the already mentioned headache problems are prevented. Normally in this situation usually comes sleep in the last moments of the night, and although not the same as being in bed, at least rest and prevent greater evils. Another possible cause of insomnia is the south wind in spring. In this case, insomnia occurs because the body is used to the cold and the arrival of sudden heat causes like causing effect coffee on the body, just the opposite of what happens in autumn. In this case as in the above, it is best to avoid the rush and let our body adapt itself, without forcing chemicals, because certainly after a few days, everything will return to normal. Tips. Cough. We all know how annoying it coughs, but what few know is that persistent cough in many cases is not only the result of an infection but from our own reckless behavior. Because often the mistake of coughing whenever scratchy throat is committed, and what people do not understand is that when coughing a vicious circle whereby more sore throat which in turn causes more coughing is generated. In this case as in most diseases we ourselves can make the solution easily. When the sore throat begins, just have to put up a minute without coughing, and after that short time the itch disappear and throat will return to normal. There is only one case in which a moderate cough can be useful, and that is when mucus are formed in the bronchi. In this case it is useful to expel the outside, but in other situations coughing whenever scratchy throat only causes more itching and irritation. Another suitable measure to avoid cough is never to breathe through his mouth, for the reason that normally breathe through the nose is that it is no mechanism to heat the air and to prevent microbes pass into the lungs, but when breathe through your mouth this preventive measure does not act and facilitates respiratory diseases attack us. Tips against gastroenteritis. This disease is one of the most annoying, attacking our digestive system and is caused by a virus. This virus has as main food source our own food, so the best way to kill it is drastically reducing our food intake. This does not mean we should stop eating, but limit ourselves to a smaller amount of food until our body to produce the antibodies needed to kill the virus and start to feel better. Actually the fact of reducing food intake has momentarily harm our health, since the body has essential reserves accumulated as fat under the skin or in organs like the liver. It is also recommended that food ingested during those days of fasting for the duration of the disease are of vegetable and low fat, because they are easier to digest. The man is too naive to think that all health problems should be solved with drugs. Medicines are sometimes necessary, but we must understand that generally most diseases are only the symptom of an imbalance in the body caused by our own unhealthy habits of life, and therefore the solution is not to take medicine but to eliminate those causes that produce disease. It is true that our body is not always able alone to defeat the virus, but it is also true that the main goal of pharmaceutical companies is not to cure disease but to sell drugs, and sometimes these drugs cause more problems than they solve. Therefore it is essential to consider the self-healing ability of our body and lead a healthy life. The skin. Many people worry about losing your skin hydration and consequently money spent on cosmetics. But they do not understand it is that in most cases are themselves the cause of this dryness. The cause is the excessive use made of degreasers. People do not understand that our body naturally causes the amount of oil that the skin needs, but we mistakenly use degreasers every time we wash without realizing that, thus eliminating this natural layer that protects the skin. Therefore the solution is simple: we only use degreasing soaps in those cases where we have stained with grease, and still must use a moderate amount to just remove excess fat from the skin and not all. Because it is itself stupid degreasers filled skin causing it is dry, and then use expensive cosmetics to restore hydration before you have removed. We must not let fool us sellers of cosmetics, because the skin does not need to be added or proteins, or vitamins, much less false rejuvenating products, because everything the skin needs is a healthy diet and respecting their own nature. Spring and irritability. Many people happens to feel more irritable than normal during the spring. I think the cause is a virus called herpes among other organs acts in the brain. A characteristic sign of their presence is the feeling of discomfort to light of the sun. These symptoms occur in spring because during winter cold maintained lethargic many types of viruses and bacteria that are relived with increasing temperature. Once the body itself generates the right to combat this type of virus, antibodies sensations become normal. This virus can cause nervousness, irritability, and insomnia, but in no case can prevent us to act with discretion and objectivity. For those who are usually wise, not change the fact this feeling slightly nervous. Possibly all be over after a slight headache. Another consequence that can cause the spring virus is depression. This depression is not only the result of the discomfort caused by infections, but may partly be caused deliberately by our own body as a natural anti-inflammatory method, since depression can cause a relaxing effect, which helps to reduce fever and discomfort, so you could say that sometimes can be therapeutic. Moderate depression can also be useful in the event of an upset or nervous disorder. It can protect the brain from neurological damage, act as against the tensions that are usually associated with these emotional states. The perfect man. One could say that today man has already reached its maximum level of progress as far as the genetic aspect is concerned. However, this does not mean that all people have the same level of genetic quality, since the presence of hereditary diseases they are widespread across the globe. This is an outstanding account for all governments in the world, because the more you delay in taking action, the greater suffering for the population. It could be said that at present, only 15% of citizens are free of these diseases, and therefore it would be desirable to create an eradication program that completely eliminated. In this way the man of the future may be genetically better, but not because it has evolved, but because they have eliminated all those genetic defects that hinder the development of their own potential. And hereditary diseases like morbid obesity or Alzheimer's disease could be eradicated forever, giving mankind a great boost social progress. One of the methods that could be used for genetic correction that would prohibit having more than one child to couples who carry inherited diseases, in contrast allow more children to couples who were free of these diseases. In the event that a couple had set the limit of one child per couple, but the son did not inherit any disease, then it could be free of this restriction and would become part of the population group considered healthy. This is possible because that one parent carries a hereditary disease. It does not mean that all your children have to necessarily inherit. With this system, one child per couple, the number of people who had genetic diseases would decrease gradually until it disappears. This system would apply only to a fraction of the population at the same time, starting with the most serious illnesses, and once these are removed after the milder happen. Another method that could be used to eliminate genetic diseases would select the sick genes and remove them from the eggs, and later replace them with healthy ones. although this method is far more complicated than the previous one, and also the risk of causing mutations runs unwanted. Since ancient times there is a natural method of correcting genetic flaws that works by our own ability to mate choice. This means that when a person decides that the couple that will make your family be beautiful or well, actually it does is encourage their own children are. Because when we choose the person you're going to have children, what we are doing is to determine what features will inherit them. Thus sexual selection is essential to decide which qualities will future generations. This shows that the desire to have a beautiful and healthy couple is not only desirable but our duty, because that favor the progress of future generations and avoid unnecessary suffering to our descendants to prevent such unfortunate inherit the genetic diseases. However, this natural system is not foolproof, because many people are not able to know that hereditary diseases transports, so set up a program to eradicate these diseases conducted by specialists would be useful to ensure genetic health future generations. So far I have referred to the perfection of man on the physical aspect, but we must not forget that man is the union of body and spirit, and that only when humanity complete their development in the moral aspect, you have completed the essential stage progress and it may be considered truly evolved. In recent centuries scientific progress has made great progress, but that technological progress will not continue indefinitely at the pace has today, because what we call progress is rather a process of evolution in which mankind has to develop those potentials it deserves to have, and when that scientific progress occurs almost ended or significantly reduced. When it reaches that point mankind will have completed their essential stage of evolution and consequently the pace of social and technological change will be reduced. It is as if he had graduated from a university hypothetical galactic, so it will become an adult planet in the universe. Those who believe that technological progress will continue indefinitely at current rates to be able to provide everything that we wish to prove profoundly naive. For the purpose of progress is that man is made as being scientifically advanced and with immense technology, but limited to its place in the universe, because everything is not possible. Man can do many things, but only those that make sense within of natural laws. Arguably today modern man is like having a perfect body, but governed by an imperfect mind. The balance between the two values will only come when humanity ends its moral progress, which is far more delayed than technological. This is because in order to progress philosophically a certain degree of privacy and concentration, which at first seems to contradict the factors necessary for life, for to live usually work is needed needs to be based on social relations and extroverted life. Therefore arguably is only possible interest devote philosophy when all other social aspects such as attention to work or children are resolved. This problem does not occur when it comes to achieving technological progress, because a man can live without difficulties dedicated to research work, but it is much more difficult if it is what it is to live philosophy. Therefore in order that man may be perfect in both the flat material or physical and spiritual or philosophical level, it is necessary to delve into the world of philosophy and learn to understand the universe and discover their own creative potential for and to eradicate the prejudices that prevent you from completing its evolution. A mistake that is often repeated is to believe that the man of the future will be highly evolved technological aspect, but not in the moral aspect, but this would not make sense, because progress is the path that runs from darkness to light and precisely characterized by providing light to the shadows and truth to lies. Therefore, the man of the future will be perfect in physical appearance, having a body free of disease, but will also be perfect in the spiritual aspect, for having eradicated all those unbalanced behaviors that keep you from being happy. Of course the man of the future also was wrong at times and will life changes, but when I say it will be perfect I mean that will be over the essential process of development, which will become an evolved being of the cosmos. Chapter 2, Policy. The Batterer. Extreme nationalism is like an abusive husband. When he thinks he can no longer demand more, the state performs as possible aggression is an attempt to secede in order to destroy the country. It seems that the more you give in to their demands, the greater the virulence of their acts, as does a spoiled child, because it is logical that a moderate nationalist subsides when the state shown considerate of your requests, but truth is that radical nationalists his people do not care and politics is only a means to conceal their wickedness. Similarly, an abusive husband is addicted to mistreat, is to entertain, and when he learns that his wife will leave holds the greatest possible aggression is murder. It is as if trying to accumulate in a single act all attacks that would plan to do and cannot. They always look for a victim who attack with which to boost your ego. The Nazis used the Jews, nationalists used the state, and abusers used to their partners. Watch the straw in your neighbor's eye and forget the beam in their own. An abuser tries to dehumanize his victim so that others eyebrows that abuse and not realize that the perpetrator is a scoundrel. Actually, a batterer has no ideology, because ideology is to hurt others, so always join extremist groups, because they will be offered bloodshed course disguised as legitimate act. The job. It is true that the work helps us to realize ourselves as individuals, but it is false that the more you work in the day is best for our health. This belief leads only to make man into a mere instrument of the exploiters. Someday people will understand that besides the work should be the main instrument to ensure happiness, either by gains acquired either by the entertainment itself that work provides, for man is made by nature to work, but of course in his good measure. Gradually humanity understand that it is through work and resources that science gives us as to achieve happiness and not through war or violence. It is also important to understand that only a coordinated system can be guaranteed social rights, i.e. only when the number of inhabitants matches the available jobs can achieve full employment. It is also necessary that the birth rate is the necessary to ensure the renewal of the population. This rate is equivalent to about 2 children per couple, so it is necessary for governments to enhance birth when scarce, but also penalized when excessive. It makes no sense to have a child if it lacks the resources to maintain it, nor makes sense to allow uncontrolled immigration, which causes a drop in wages and number of unemployed, as the limited employment. You also need to understand that if both men and women are dedicated to working, nobody will care to have and raise children. Feminist such thinking as is raised today is completely wrong. It proposes that the ideal woman is one that has as its ultimate goal to emulate men, and therefore interest birth is being replaced by the profit motive and social prestige in the workplace. This way of thinking is leading Western society to its own self-extermination. Therefore, it is necessary to understand that men and women should be complementary and not competing in the same social functions, because it was nature that decided it was the woman who gave birth and suckle their children. This does not mean that it must be considered inferior to men, since both sexes are actually a specialization of nature with the same rights to be free and happy, but with different social functions. The intelligent man is one who is fond of his wife because he is the best ally you can have. Their tasks may be different, but not to be considered as implying the right to mistreat your partner. A marriage relationship must be understood as mutual and voluntary agreement in which each member assumes performing different tasks for the common good, but never questioned the right of both spouses to have the same right to be free and happy. It is also important to understand that it is healthier work little long to work hard for a short time. It is necessary to understand more work as entertainment than as an obligation and design jobs thinking of the welfare of workers, as the idleness leads to illness and premature death, as the energy that food provides cause disease if they are not channeled through work. Therefore retirement as currently understood is an error derived from the belief that work is something wrong. The fact that tends to displace people over work is the main cause of youth, and people tend to hide their age with hair dyes to be ashamed of age overestimate. Therefore, it is necessary to return to older people the place they had in antiquity, and use its wisdom in the work as counselors, workers and management positions. Left and right. It is pathetic to see how the political formations are mainly divided between left and right, as if it were only true one and not the other. Already existed in ancient times this kind of ideological divisions between the states of Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta represented the left to the right. Athens represented democracy, but democracy hypocritical, because it was only for a few, while there was an immense number of slaves and people without political rights. At present it is considered to Sparta as its ideological rival, but actually had no major differences with Athens, as though it was in many similar aspects to a military dictatorship. However, it was not an absolutist monarchy, because he had the power shared between the king and Ephoros, but like Athens was a highly slave state, so as to define some Democrats and others do not. It's really simplistic. Athens defended freedom of opinion and democracy for the few, but in the social and economic sphere was an unfettered slave model, which only took into account the market and self-interest, but with little moral value. Sparta had less ideological freedom, but promoted equality between citizens with civil rights and had a great concept of race, ethics, and morality, unlike Athens. The ideal Greek state would have been the one who had an appreciation for democracy and free markets in Athens, but that wealth would raise as a means to a higher cause, as represented Sparta. When finished World War II, the social model that prevailed in the West was the Athenian style, characterized the political aspect by not libertarian democracy apparent, libertine, where the motto is laissez-faire, while politicians get rich with public money, a model in which citizens are used as puppets, as only allowed a symbolic political participation, consisting only choose their leaders, but without any direct influence on the laws, because the real power they have a minority of politicians and businessmen. On the economic side it is characterized by a materialistic approach, in which the only important thing is the market, with little or no regard for ethics or morality. At present, the political groups of the left are essentially ideologists, i.e. offering everything that the workers wanted, but without raising any effective economic measure, since in most cases lack sufficient training, and when in power often they cause more damage to the economy that benefits its little realism, as was the example of communism. They complain of political corruption, but they are primarily responsible for that criminals do not serve their sentences, then propose a ridiculous penalties in proportion to the crimes committed, thereby causing impunity. They complain of low wages, but they are the culprits by favoring illegal immigration. In the moral aspect, the left is proclaimed contrary to religion, because it confuses religion with religious organization. It does not understand that religion is what differentiates man from animals. Right instead tries to show an image of religiosity lacking, therefore, it makes a pact with religious organizations so that these would provide a moral alibi with which to continue exploiting the people without being noticed. At the end it ends up confusing one with the other and mistakenly blame religion for the crimes committed by religious organizations. They do not understand that religion is primarily a form of philosophy, while religious organizations which attempt is appropriate that philosophy to gain power. Commit the audacity to ascribe to themselves the exclusive communication between God and man, denying citizens the right to speak freely. Thus they seek to control their minds in an act of supreme hypocrisy. Political right-wing groups aspire to power, especially because they believe they belong by nature, believed privileged, unlike leftist politicians are pragmatists, because although dominated by ambition, they are more realistic economically, because of its more knowledge in business management. Really misconception is that the truth belongs only to some and nothing to others, because ideally create a world with ideological expectations of the left, but with pragmatism and economic knowledge of the right. Politicians on each side incite citizens against their opponents, but like politicians of ancient Greece just covet power for themselves, and refuse equally to create a genuine democracy, namely that the laws are decided by citizens and not by those selfish politicians as now. The fallacy of multiculturalism. What a big mistake is to defend the existence of a multicultural society, because there is really nothing more than an authentic culture that is the truth. Therefore, we must strive to reject those mistaken customs, however much be categorized as ancestral traditions or cultures. Of course it is necessary to respect the free will of each person and each country so they can find the truth for themselves, but it is also our duty to refuse to collaborate with all that is wrong. Today there are those who insist to regard as the most natural thing in the world to mix races and cultures, some located in a developmental level of the Stone Age to contemporary society, but such a thing is an attack against progress, because the fact that one culture is superior to the other does not imply that those who have lived in the most backward culture are to be folded without the superior culture of the more advanced countries. For those immigrants who come from countries with these primitive cultures, obviously not confined to accept the culture of their hosts just because they are told that it is superior, because they thought that true culture is yours, because even being wrong, not they want to recognize. For every race and every culture has its own distinct natural inertia, and this inevitably leads to the development of conflicts between the two communities. Because it is logical, it is that two peoples with different cultural level evolve without mixing, to make it a more harmonious development process as possible. Because in reality there is only a culture worthy of appreciation, and that culture is derived from science and progress, and an advanced society technologically cannot make the mistake of mixing with races and cultures much more backward than yours for risk social disintegration that entails. An example of this we have with blacks in the United States. They were taken to that country for centuries to exploit them as slaves, but even today the social fusion is still a pending issue, however much media such as film try to convince us otherwise. Once slavery disappeared, they began to see as a nuisance, and as a result laws such as the legalization of firearms were created, with the vile intention to carry out a campaign of extermination of the race under the qualification acts of self-defense, that is intended to be used the excuse of defense against crime as a pretext for justifiable the disappearance of as many of these people, considering that the number of offenders black is greater than white race. That is, once they ceased to be used as slaves, they tried to eliminate rather than recognizing their land rights. That's when the transfer of blacks to Africa was proposed, or when this infamous law was created to allow the extermination of blacks dedicated to crime. Therefore, the only correct the problem of multiculturalism present in the world solution is not racial or cultural miscegenation, but respect for each race and territorial integrity. For countries like the United States, it would be fair that land surrender to citizens of every race to create their own independent states, where every race and every culture can evolve free and at your own pace, thus preventing conflicts arising from pretend to mix the past and the future in the same geographical space. Because our bodies are not different by chance, but as the result of biological progress gained over thousands of years, a biological progress but will not be seen with the naked eye is present in every cell of our body, and we will adapt gradually to the various scientific scenarios that cause changes. For this reason miscegenation makes no sense, each culture having a different level of progress. Because interbreeding actually intended only to economic exploitation that benefits few but hurts most by causing an inevitable social maladjustment. It is true that all the races belong to the same species, but it is also true that they are different and should follow different paths, especially if you also are at different levels of technological evolution. The truth is that each race was made by nature to live in different climates and among their peers, where each individual must progress. Without this, why keep the good relationship between all races of Earth? Because in reality, many of the politicians who support miscegenation just use it as a pretext to justify their own imperialist campaigns. It is therefore necessary that the major military powers assume that they must respect the political independence of every race, so they can develop free and without outside interference. A nation cannot be just a sum of people, it must be a people with their own culture and rationale. Someday only exist in the world one race and one culture, but not by crossbreeding or by the imposition of anyone, but by the evolution of each race to truth. Because truth there is only one, and when society understands this reality and abandon their mistaken beliefs, the world will become increasingly similar. It is therefore necessary that all races evolve free and without interference of others, so that each can evolve as your own natural rhythm, because the fate of all races is to become equal. When the progress of technology allow the weather in cities across the earth is the same, then these will evolve to be identical. And just as there will only be a culture which is the culture of truth, but this will only be possible when all the false myths are permanently expelled from the earth, and then the world can live in peace, with the light that science can provide. Fake majority. In the current political system, so-called democracies, it is considered that the majority vote represents the feelings of the citizens, but it is important to note that psychopaths, politicians and scoundrels always resort to the support of the majority as an alibi argument to justify its own dictatorship. Indeed, all political parties resort to deception and lies as a way to get power, but there are cases where this goes so far as was the Nazi era or dictatorial models that occur frequently in the world. Another example of vile manipulation are some nationalist movements such as those in Spain, because they use the tactic of provoking the state with the hope that it will react excessively so we can charge him with assault on their rights, all in order to increase with lies citizen support. Another of his tactics is to try to seize education in schools, in order to instill nationalist hatred in the students, hoping that once they become adults give them their votes. Therefore, the essential question is not just what is the meaning of the vote of the citizens, but it is more important to know to what extent the various political forces have manipulated to distort its true sense. Nationalist extremists invent false enemies, like the German Nazis did to the Jews, all in order that people may not realize that they are the real enemies. Because the truth is that psychopaths do not need any reason to do evil because they carry within them, however, resort to things like politics only as a way to hide his true personality and give their behavior an appearance of legitimacy that no have. The truth is that all political forces have a point in their arguments, but keep in mind that progress is to add and not subtract, to unite and not separate. Certainly there are cases where political separation of the territories is adequate, especially when there are large differences of race or culture, but it is always better to try to find a deal that will convince everyone, rather than seeking to break sole purpose. Some think that aggressive nationalism is the result of aggressive states, but Spain is just the opposite. It is precisely the wider is the self-government of autonomy and independence of the regions, where most aggressive is show nationalist parties. This is because in Spain at the beginning of the democratic transition in 1975 opted for a less centralized consistent constitutional model in the so-called proportional system. With this system, it is usual that at the end of the elections the largest party does not reach the number of seats needed to govern, therefore, is forced to compromise with minority parties, in most cases nationalist. The problem is that the formation of these agreements is done by these parties blackmail the government due to achieve the gradual destruction of the state. With this system, the nationalist parties gain power that does not correspond to its true dimension, i.e. that end up being the spoiled children of the country, without too much trouble receiving most of the demands they ask. Thus, a political system originally thought to be negotiating and openness, ends up becoming discriminatory for regions not participating in government formation while hostage to a minority parties with an excessively large power. In my opinion, by a majority constitutional system has been chosen, the majority needed to govern could have been obtained by a second vote between the top two parties, thus any regional party would have been able to participate as an associate of these parties, but without exert such a direct influence on the entire state. In addition, this privilege granted by the state nationalists, ends up causing a totalitarian regime and manipulative in their regions against non-nationalists. This is obviously directly because of those national parties and their selfish to obtain the parliamentary majority interest ultimately betraying the rest, but also because of a proportional system that favors discrimination for those communities that are not involved in the formation of the government and so does the opposite of what it should do, which is the promotion of democracy and equality. All this shows that excessive aggressiveness demonstrated by the nationalists is not the result of an alleged abuse by the state as they claim, but rather by the monopoly allowed by the government in its autonomous communities to the point of not recognizing neither law nor constitution. Racial integrity. People easily forget that the progress of civilization has always been linked to the integrity of races. An example of this is in the rise of Greece and Rome. These nations became great when they were homogeneous societies. Was the racial likeness what made them strong, and was precisely the expansion of slavery that destroyed them because priority was given to the market on people, the business of dignity? Racial miscegenation acted like a wedge into the crack a stone, fracturing progressively. The latest example of this is the United States. This nation grew strongly as a racially pure and most of its immigrants were of European origin, who was also at that time the most developed part of the world, that together with its racial homogeneity gave strong growth as a result of the state. In fact, the policy of that time favored this situation. But its current model pro-crossbreeding is taking this country to a lack of direction and erratic both a national and international politics. But perhaps the clearest example we have in the history of Sparta, this same nation that the United States grew strongly as a racially pure, this policy was also favored by the state, however sank to fall into the mistake of promoting slavery, to be more slaves than free citizens. It is impossible for a nation to exist for long periods when the majority of its citizens are slaves. Also in the case of Sparta these slaves were natives of the land and therefore of the same race for the Spartans, so it was even more slavery absurd to apply them, considering that if they had been made, there would have been racial difference. The gradual decline of persons entitled to citizenship and ability to participate in the army, triggered an increasingly unstable situation that ended with the sudden collapse of this nation. Unfortunately, while Sparta represented the best but also the worst thing a company can have. But today's society refuses to be self-critical, stunned by the events of the Second World War. This situation of confusion and power vacuum was exploited by immigrants to enter Europe en masse and often violently, but the most absurd of all is that the European authorities reward these invaders, giving them economic aid without, but they are denied to those who contributed to someday make use of the aid. Society needs to understand that not everything is, and that the market is not the only important, and that above all is the dignity and culture that race itself represents. History shows that these facts are true, much as contemporary topics that people do not want to see. Society must understand that this corrupt political class is only interested in personal enrichment, not caring the least of society it represents. Great nations like the United States or Rome were mainly created by a society of free peasants who felt love for their homeland and shared the same level of cultural progress, because slavery only serves to provide a wealth-vain tyrants. But today's society is repeating the same mistake of Sparta, creating a system based on a minority of elderly whites maintained by a majority population of slaves or immigrants with deplorable economic conditions system, depending on how you prefer to call. Is being repeated again. Biblical Tower Babel, chaos mix of races and cultures, in which the only motto is the selfish interests of the exploiters, but no benefit for other citizens. Society must correct this serious mistake, protecting their racial and cultural identity, returning each race in its proper place, so that in this way better guarantee their rights and can form their own free nations. Because justice is born of equality and not interbreeding, that tyrants seek to impose. Any idea must be respected if done peacefully. Because of the violent people, of any political sign, many times certain ideas are considered misleading and erroneous considered certain, therefore, it is necessary to do an exercise of impartiality and analyze the facts without preconceived ideas. True superiority. Since the end of World War II, humanity is confused about the concept of superiority, because due to the crimes of the Nazis that word tends to be associated with evil or abuse of some human beings to others, but the truth is the superiority of some species for others is something that exists in nature without this having to be controversial. It is as acceptable the possibility of the existence of superior species and superior races. Therefore, the fact that there are species or higher races does not have to involve cruelty of some races to the other, because in the case of the human species all races are necessary, because each of them is the consequence of their adaptation to different climates on Earth. The truth is that the real superiority is through human and godly behavior as demonstrated, not tyranny. For those who rely on racial grounds to do evil not demonstrate this superiority, but rather the most mediocre impulses and backward own of the most primitive individuals, because despotic behavior are more typical of scoundrels and bandits than superior beings. Therefore, there is nothing dishonorable in believing that a race can be superior to another, but that does not mean that you have the right to mistreat others, for all species and all races have a role on Earth and are entitled to be respected and to live in freedom. Because the fact that a race can be superior to another does not imply the right to use other, as though this were true, we are all human beings belong to the same species. The concept of racial superiority can determine differences regarding climate zone on the planet to live or another kind of circumstances, but in no case would entitle preference or servility of some races over others. Social justice. In a developed society it is absurd to have citizens in a situation of social exclusion, as everyone can and should participate in the benefits of the system because there is no reason for a city organized dispenses with any of its members. It is therefore necessary to create a comprehensive system whereby all citizens have the state guarantee to have a housing in which to live and work in that part of social activity. Of course, reserve these rights only to those citizens who are nationals legally recognized. For this to be possible it is necessary, because otherwise obviously the people of those nations who would not have created these social systems try to benefit from them, causing the failure of the system. This is therefore not a question of solidarity, but common sense. It is a duty of all nations to create these social systems regardless of their wealth, because solidarity of the state towards its citizens has nothing to do with rent per capita but with human dignity, and therefore those who pass needs in these countries what they have to do is hold their government's policy change rather than trying to seize by force of these social services in countries that if they have. It is therefore necessary that all countries of the world as an essential issue raised its population matches the wealth necessary to maintain the entire population and avoid passing necessity. This would be accomplished by creating laws birth control. Another key issue is to be clear that all social assistance should always be returned by the recipient through a program of work for the state, because otherwise it will be encouraging picaresque those who merely collect the state but refusing to work. Therefore those who do not agree to work for the state to repay the aid cannot live by begging, because in a social system in which no one is unassisted right and logical that begging is prohibited. The submissive woman. To make it possible coexistence between the couple is necessary that women understand that this coexistence is only possible if she shows submissive man, this submission in no way be construed as slavery, because this situation only makes sense if she accepts him voluntarily. In every ship captain necessary, and every government a president, therefore, in every marriage is also necessary to have who perform the function of command is necessary. So the idea of submission only makes sense understood as a voluntary assignment of women to men in exchange for consideration, which if not given, it would be logical that it requires the separation. The intelligent man is one who is affectionate with your partner and puts interest in her to have everything you need, so the control function only in marriage must be understood as a democratic presidential task and not a dictatorship. It is a collaborative effort between the two spouses to take the family along. So it is correct to understand that gender roles are different, but that association is voluntary for both and only the result of a mutual commitment. Because it is nature in its great wisdom which decided that each sex is different, so they have different roles in life, that function in no way be seen as inferior but only as different. The man represents the sun, the center command. The woman represents earth, water, spirituality. Both are the expression in human form gives the bipolarity of the cosmos, both equally important, both with the same right to be happy, but also two different roles in life. Therefore, the idea of submission of women to men should be seen more as a game designed to give stability to marriage as something that deprive anyone of their rights, as the duty of man is to take into account the views of his family in all his actions, and decide between all the actions to be carried out by consensus. This should be a reciprocal relationship in which the woman gives the command to man, but with the condition that they use to seek the welfare of his family, so the belief that one has to be better than the other it is erroneous as a fair relationship is one in which both must be equally satisfied. Is that man should preside over the marriage but to serve his family, therefore the question of who serves whom no longer depend on the view with which you look. The current marriage model, inspired by feminist myths, has led to a situation of enormous stress many men, that provoke a permanent sense of insecurity, because in case of separation law usually gives generally all assets of the couple women, ordinary housing, children, and much of the salary husband, creating in man the feeling that the law is working with them in their own humiliation, especially if we consider that in many cases this leads inevitably poverty, lacking most of the money men needed to maintain the level of expenditure that are required by law. Therefore, it would be good to give such separation, the law is consistent and truly considered as such, giving both spouses equal right to enjoy the goods of the couple, or the right to raise their children on an equal footing. Logically, with the exception of those cases was demonstrated that the negligent attitude of one of them during the marital cohabitation. For if a law is discriminatory and seeks the humiliation of men, then you are preventing them rebuild their lives, then creating a situation of obvious injustice of which they certainly blame their wives even being innocent. Feminism is guilty of sowing discord in couples, to induce women to believe that their duty in life is to compete with men for the same social functions, when that is not the case. A marriage first and foremost must be an agreement between two people by each spouse to specialize in different tasks in order to be just as happy, but without implying that it means having to perform the same functions. An intelligent man is one who worries that his wife did not miss anything, to fill it with care and takes into account their views to be happy, but who think that a woman is better than man just for the sake of it proves to be deeply naive. The feminist myth that man is indebted to women, has led many women believe they can be bad with men without feeling pangs of conscience. Certainly there are things that should change both by men and by women, but it is also true that nature created the sexes so that each specialize in different tasks, not to favor one over the other, but for the good of all. The key that makes sense that women accept give the man the administrator role of the family, or in other words to accept cede the control function, is in the fact that the essential purpose of life does not have to necessarily obtaining positions of political relevance or otherwise, but to achieve maximum happiness, and in the case of women that happiness is linked indissolubly to its realization as a mother and housewife as main tasks, thereby the transfer of command to the man or his greater presence in the workplace, need not imply that women have to be less happy, especially considering that a marriage is a strong union in which the benefits of this relationship must be for both spouses alike. This means that the control function of man in marriage should only be aimed to stabilize the relationship, but in no way be taken to this assignment in command implies that women should lose their freedom or may be less happy than man, for that transfer of leadership must always be democratic, i.e. taking into account the views of women and always chasing the good of the couple. Therefore, the participation of women in the workplace must be regarded as perfectly acceptable, but as long as his task as mother and housewife has been sufficiently satisfied. Nature decided that the men and women were different, not one is less happy than the other, but because their specialization in different tasks can offer a happier life for both. Unfortunately, many of the laws that have been created in Europe to promote the integration of women in the labor market have only served to provoke a sharp decline in the birth rate to critical levels, all with the sole purpose of getting the female vote heavily influenced by feminist organizations. This results from the merely utopian but false belief that women should imitate all men to be held as a person. As a result, in countries where most have implemented these policies, the birth rate has fallen to levels insufficient to acceptable population renewal, but politicians keep quiet about it and just propose to fix mediocre formulas, such as paying women some money to stay in state, rather than tackling the problem at its root, which is to recognize that the feminist project for women based on mere imitation of man, is completely wrong. Feminism tries to convince women that man is bad just for being different, but the truth is that the greatest treasure that a man can have is a woman who wants really. Why those who mistreat his wife is not to be sexist, it is that they are stupid. Feminists use the word equality in a frivolous manner, as would have us believe that equality between men and women is only possible as long as they perform the same functions in life, but such a thing is absurd, because the concept of equality is only applicable pure and evidently men and women are not. It makes no sense to demand equality for what is different when really it is, because the word discrimination can only be applied when starting from the same situations the deal is different, but when it is clear that men and women are different is also logical to think their roles in life can be so without that is why have considered discriminatory treatment, with simply different tasks because they are different. Therefore, true equality that it is fair claim for women is as to their right to be happy and to be treated with dignity, like men want to do, because women are no less important than men only by being different, and therefore they should have the same right to be respected and to live freely. Not to be confused different with worse, because the fact that men and women are different, can justify that their lives are different, but are just as important for the progress of humanity. Law and freedom. In any organized society there need to be laws to coordinate the population so that the system can work. From a certain point of view one might think that this limits their own freedom, but an advanced society cannot exist without the existence of common rules in cases where circumstances affecting the entire population. Therefore, the key to which there is no contradiction between the existence of mandatory laws and the right of free will would be the development of a consistent voting system and allow every citizen to propose any changes it deems necessary. This voting system would not only elect political leaders, but above all serve so that every citizen could make proposals to consider appropriate or to change existing laws. This system also could be done by using internet so that the interaction between the political system and citizens were constant and truly democratic. With this voting system, politicians might have the initiative in proposing the actions to take, because that's their job. Those citizens who were as they would have to do nothing, because their abstention would be counted as support for the proposal the state, but to be against, the proposal would be rejected if the number of votes against exceeds half the existing census. Thus citizen freedom of choice would have its maximum expression in this system of voting constant. The laws emanating from this system of voting would be mandatory for everyone, but everyone could participate and it was appropriate to make changes. Once this system was implemented, manipulations and political intrigue, since power no longer belonged to politicians as now, would end. Once citizens had the final say in deciding a law, there would be no reason for full campaign of promises and lies, because things will not be decided in a single vote every few years, but every one of laws depend on the direct decision of all citizens. Additionally, this ideal system, the profession of political opportunism, not be subject to or adherence to parties, but it would be a college career like any other. The misogyphobes. When World War II ended, the world became aware of the atrocities committed by the Nazis in their campaign of extermination against the Jews, the psychological impact that occurred, along with the fact that the war had won Germany's enemies. He led a campaign to discredit anything that had to do with the Nazis, on the one hand that the world knew the horrors caused by them, but also to accept factly the existence of new masters of the world represented in the United States and its allies. It is that it was just to alert the excesses committed by the Nazis during the war, but also to create the false belief that every conceivable evils are applicable to Nazism and every imaginable benefits they are applicable to the winners of war. This is what the two military blocs that were left after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, tried to instill in the minds of citizens, but, as expected, also accusing the other bloc of the same criticisms applied to Nazis, to try to undermine his power and achieve world domination. But, as history shows, wars are not among truths or lies, but between nations that try to prevail against the other, almost always to promote the benefit of its ruling classes aside workers. Citizens are told that their duty is to participate in the war, but the benefits always goes to the rich. Therefore, is a serious mistake to think that the fact that the Nazis lost the war implies that they are wrong at all, such as in opposing racial mixtures. The trouble is that when an army is defeated, the facts of the war are recounted, telling the truth about the crimes committed by them, but concealing the reasons or arguments in his defense might have. At the same time, after the war, the victorious powers were devoted to conceal their own embarrassments, such as the effects of the atomic bombs brought on civilians in Japan, because of the radiation, or also the campaign of harassment Arab world carried out by the US in Iraq and Syria in order to wrest from Russia all allied countries, while supporting Israel, in a clear example of imperialism. There seems to be an unjustified need to provoke wars with which to pay US arms companies for their financial support to political parties. In addition, after the end of the war, it was instilled in the collective mind that all who defend that races should live without mixing had to be forcibly sick, and so the word xenophobia, thus invented, would no longer be necessary to explain why those who advocated these ideas were wrong. It was enough to use this word and everyone would know that this is a taboo subject and that those go inside it will be considered sick or enemies of the ruling power. Thus the victors of the war served the fear of the Nazis as a way to control the population and to justify its own global hegemony and its campaign of imperialism, i.e. that citizens are frightened against others to hide their own crimes. But the most pathetic of all is that this method of intimidation and alarm is the same used by the Nazis against the Jews and now use the victors of the war to scare citizens, and that they are more easily subject to its own global hegemony. All this at the end of the day are merely strategies of mental manipulation to hide the truth. I prevent citizens think, because the better you opine about Germany or the Nazis, logically less fear will have to oppose the hegemony imposed by the victors of the Second World War. Proof of this are the many military bases that the US has spread worldwide. It would therefore be logical to think that if those who peacefully oppose racial mixtures they should call contemptuously xenophobes, then the logical thing would be to consider that those who support the interbreeding would have to call them misogyphobes, i.e. those who fear and hysterically opposed to those who argue that the races must maintain their integrity without mixing, because there are cases where you get to act violently, or resignation of those who defend these ideas peacefully. Required. It is as if he had implanted a single thought, which was forbidden to deviate from the official policy on the matter in the least. it being understood that those who defend the thesis of racial superiority or opposes racial mixtures necessarily it has to be like the Nazis and therefore can be insulted and lynched without fear of public criticism. Today is socially accepted that man is superior to the monkey, and yet that does not mean that is why those who believe that defending the monkey should be maltreated or exterminated, then, why it is considered that those who oppose racial mixtures evil necessarily intended for other races. Clearly this is a prefabricated thought so interested to consolidate the new rule of the victors of the war, a domain that seeks to impose saying that the fact of supporting miscegenation makes them different from the Nazis and thus legitimizes them as they to create a world empire to his taste, but really its purpose is to make the working class in a mixture of mestizos slaves in a chaotic and full of class differences in society. The miscegephobes intended to defend the virtues of miscegenation, but how will you explain this to the victims of crimes committed by illegal immigrants? As the terrorist attacks and all kinds of violations and crimes. Or who have lost their jobs because their bosses have given to them. How can they think that a person who enters a country violating the law once inside the will to respect man is condemned to repeat the same mistakes indefinitely if it just follows the topics defended by the victorious powers of war? It is true that reject these topics involves sailing against the current, but it is also true that truth is only one and does not comply with who wins or who loses a war, but is neutral and is divided equally among all the contenders. The mentally parasites. It is striking that in this contemporary society the truth is almost always the opposite of what it seems. It is not the truth what is sought but the appearance of truth, not honesty seeks only to show to others the image is thought to they value. This is a materialistic society in which it is common boast of dignity when it is lacking, where citizens seem to give more importance to the superfluous than truly valuable. It is at this cusp of lies which is more important to doubt what they say and are precisely those who feel disillusioned with the world today, and those immunized are more likely to discover scammers. In this present moment, in which more is presumed not to be prejudiced, is the more you have, these prejudices act as genuine mental parasites, they do not provide any benefit to those who have. An example of this is the way the film shows today's world. It seems that the writers had some gods they served that they strictly set the tone of his scripts to the point of making his films in unpleasant stories, bitter and intended only to please the most radical social movements. Such is curious to see how today tends to be placed on the roles of heads to blacks, so as not to be accused of racism, but what the viewer does not understand is that they are only supporting roles, because unlike real life their salaries are lower than those charged by white actors. Although they do not play roles of chiefs, however their roles themselves are main and hence better paid. All in order to pretend normality does not exist and serve those false gods that seems to be delivered this hypocritical society, those false gods proposing feminism or pro-miscegenation as something ideal, when only leading to self-destruct Western society. We are told that there are no racial differences when even a child 2 years distinguishes. Therefore critics gleefully those who defend the racial integrity do not realize that they are criticizing God, for it was God or nature, as preferred call, who decided to put a different race on every continent, and all that work thousands of years of evolution this hypocritical society is destroying. The screenwriters trying to create an unrealistic view of the world and thus satisfy current fashion, based on supporting miscegenation therefore propose a relationship between blacks and whites, and the black always it appears in his films as the faithful servant of the white, always ready to make mere compliment this, as if it were only a loyal and loving dog, as if a black could never be evil, or at least not to the extent that target. All in order to suggest the white man to accept miscegenation under the premise that the black man will always serve as an instrument of their whims and not as a genuine free man. Since the power this view of things is favored to achieve an apparent calm in the social mass, with respect to interracial tensions, so that the state can take care of an imperialist campaign that try to achieve profitability material, its victory over the Nazis, but at the cost of sacrificing the quality of life of citizens by ignoring the serious social problems that this policy creates. It is ultimately to show an apparently different from the Nazis' public image, but having the same goal as them, which is world domination. Another example of this submission to the topics is how the film presents women, because the sample with a more masculine than most manly man look, all in order to satisfy feminist groups and avoid criticism, at the end of these women seem more intractable than a group of female authentic women witches. In addition, a version of them totally unrealistic shown, in terms of their physical strength, creating the fiction of being equally corpulent than men, which is patently false, if we consider it as something representative of the majority. It is clear that those who follow this false god of feminism despise true, for it was God who decided that the men and women were different, but not that one is less than the other, but in order to specialize in different tasks to improve the species. Society must lose their fear of those false gods, for there is nothing unworthy to defend that races remain intact as nature made them, or to recognize that men and women were different events for different tasks, but with the same right to be happy. This is a hypocritical society that subordinates everything to mere desire to do business, but does not realize that by prioritizing business on the dignity is what is lost than what you get in return. Just a stupid society thinks assumed by many a lie becomes a truth, because lying always lie and the world cannot escape the consequences until they assume and correct their mistakes. Sometimes the fear of power acts as a force of gravity that distorts our perception of reality, without realizing that unconsciously we tend to justify the arguments that powerful pose us and we become mere instruments of their plans. This requires an exercise of impartiality and consider all the circumstances, beginning to doubt what they believe, because progress is to recognize our own mistakes. In addition, it is necessary to recover the ethics and morals of the importance for the progress of society, because man does not live only to work and get more money, but the purpose of work and money is to help us to be happy and live with dignity. Another example that in the end things are judged by the color of the glass we look at each other and not with justice in the case of how the film presents Native Americans, for their legitimate struggle to protect their land from white invaders. It is proposed as an infamous aggression against the colonizer, when the truth is just the opposite. It is the colonizer who stole their land and led them to near total extermination. At present there are many descendants of those settlers who regret what they did say their ancestors, but how many of them have proposed that land be delivered to those natives with which to create their own independent nation? Clearly it says and do is not the same. We live in a time when people presume to be aware and impartial, but do not realize that since childhood they are taught that we live in a democracy, when this is false, because in fact the power is reserved to a few politicians and entrepreneurs. We are told that we live in a just society where the rich every day are richer and the poor poorer, but worst of all is that people are being led inadvertently to a materialistic world that no longer will gives value or race or culture itself. Thus citizens become twice poor, one in economics and one in the spiritual, because in the end turn out to be a simple mass of mestizos, workers without principles or moral, that they do not know what society they belong or what to believe, and who have no other goal in life to produce for their masters. Workers are deceived by telling them that their duty is to support miscegenation, and they naively do, without understanding that they are only promoting their own ruin. This shows that these leftist parties that favor it, just pursue their own profit and not the good of the workers, just simply follow the topics set. People need to discuss things with real fairness to break the mental chains that hold them back into the light, and from that moment begin to be truly free. People should stop following those false idols like alcohol, feminism, pro or miscegenation, and reject destructive cults that only seek mental slavery of man, as it is based in the Vatican. You need to understand that appearances and reality are not the same, and that evil always goes where it is supposed to is good, in order to impersonate him and manipulate people. Therefore, it is a serious mistake to believe that the fact that there are good things in an ideology mean that everything in it is good, just as politics is so wrong to be very right as being very left, because truth is neutral and only those who use mental manipulation would have you believe that things can only have a single point of view. Despite all its flaws, I believe that the American cinema is still the best performing in the world. Therefore it is a pity that today is so subject to topical and contemporary prejudices only in order to be more commercial. Refugees or invasive. It is absolutely frivolous behavior of some political parties, mainly leftist, using immigration solely for partisan purposes. It qualify as refugees people who enter illegally in Europe and in many cases resorting to violence to get it, because they attack the border. Police fulfills its duty to try to avoid it. They claim that these immigrants come because they lack the essentials of life, but then how can they pay a fortune for mafias provide them boats in which to get there? In addition, when these illegal immigrants do not achieve their economic goals, often engage in crime, and when they get a contract of employment is at the expense of devaluing the salaries of the country in which they are installed, harming thus the working class. European governments are demonstrating a clear lack of self-government by equating these immigrants with full citizens, because by doing such a thing are favoring crime, to convey the message that crime does not have punishment and thereby cause increased social tension. They allow those who have entered illegally and have never paid taxes remain with social aid, instead are denied to those that did. A social system quality is only possible if there are clear limits. It is necessary that the countries of origin of these immigrants take responsibility and establish a policy of birth control by which births are in line with assets that can generate. But the worst part is that European governments are ignoring the suicide of his own people by allowing birth drops to alarming levels. A society that has no children is a sick society. The truth is that feminism has on the human mind the same effect as a birth control pill causes in the body, sterilizing the population. The proof is that it is precisely the countries where implemented is feminism where more lower rates birth, to be greater than the number of deaths than births. We need to reflect and understand that although feminism includes good things, does not mean that all its tenets are. Europe's population is letting invade doing anything about it, hoping that immigrants pay to satisfy their interests, but only a fool would think that an immigrant will defend or promote the culture of the people they are replacing, when even he asked permission to settle in their cities. A true refugee is one who enters the country authorized by the recipient and not by their own choice or through violence, because then he cannot be considered a refugee but invader. People think you are doing well by supporting illegal immigration and miscegenation, but this is the only thing that causes the lowering of wages, crime, and social disunity, in addition to serving the interests of slave traders and exploiters. It is a pity that even the media to confusion lend when they call refugees who are invaders, or say that there was a rescue when what happened is human trafficking, because who pays money to buy a boat with which try to enter a country in secret is not a castaway who needed rescuing and therefore are not rescuers who collect them but traffickers. Sooner or later society will realize the serious mistake he made, but may be too late to avoid the conflicts that this can generate. Men owe insects. It is regrettable to see how many people live their lives without performing repetitive behaviors, almost taking time to stop and watch the world around them. When this act are not different from those animals like insects whose lives are directed to do things in an automatic mode. It is true that the need to work or care for children very difficult the task of analyzing the world around us to understand, but it is also true that many people only associate the free time superfluous entertainment based on stimulus simple way, without any intellectual effort. They believe that culture is simply to learn what others have thought or written. These people do not understand that the essence of the universe is based on the ability to reflect and understand their profound truth, which is one of the most wonderful experiences that exist, because it is through this reflection when we become aware of our own existence and our ability to improve the world around us. For this reason, drugs and alcohol should be rejected by any being who appreciates his intelligence, because nullify the conscience becoming grosser automata, besides damaging our brain. The truth is that most people know only the superficial part of life. Real life begins when we try to understand the mechanics of the universe, and from there we enjoy changing that serves to improve our lives, because we are also part of evolution and therefore we can participate. Life people criticizing this despicable political class that represents us is past, but nevertheless their blatant lies are created when we say we live in a democracy when that's not true. They do not understand that the materialistic and mean people show an inordinate interest in occupying the paid positions because of their inability to know how to value the importance of small things. These people lack sensitivity and spend their mediocre lives trying to amass great fortunes, because they think that money will remedy the emptiness they feel inside, but that gap just disappears when you understand that the key to happiness lies in putting honesty and dignity to other things. Precisely for this reason such people should not occupy positions of responsibility. But all the blame is not only these despicable politicians, because they just do what they can expect from a petty being, which is rich at the expense of the people with lies. Guilt is above all of that social mass that does not understand leisure rather than as a means to obtain vain amusements, never worry about thinking and seek the real truth that is around it. It's not just walk kilometers with the car or plane, that is also good at times, but it is also important to take time to reflect on the world around us, because through meditation we can break the limitations of our material body and travel through time and space, in order to discover the wonders of the universe can provide us. Philosophy is the blood of the universe, so when we start to think we become the architects of the world around us. Arguably the philosopher is the traveler's mind, so it is important to question the things around us, because through meditation can leave the topics of our time and discover the truth located beyond appearances. Because unfortunately in this world in which we live is not literary talent, but the ability to commune with the prevailing socio-political situation, i.e. the more conventional result a book and less question the politically assumed lies, most likely to rewards being awarded in the international media, because often the economics and politics rest on tastes and misconceptions, hence the tendency to reward those who condescends to the established system. Because when a lie is assumed by most, that lie becomes law and the entire social system revolves around it, and the whole power play is designed to justify the lie, and who question it becomes enemy of those who obtained their justifying charges, that false order of values. So who you have these charges react, attacking those who try to warn of the danger, humbly telling the truth, who act and think only of greed, even at the cost of destroying the society in which they live. This is how nations often condemn to ruin and empires collapse, because once the lie is implanted in the nuclei of power, nobody can question it, and as a result are unable to stop its disintegration. It is currently fashionable to say that everything comes down to a society of bad politicians who deceive good workers, but such a thing is not true, because actually the mediocrity of the world would not be such if it were not for vagrancy class worker who is believed too easily the lies they tell them. This happens because they do not want to bother to look for themselves the truth, complain about the greed of politicians when they are greedy, complaining about the lack of ethics when they do not know which means the moral word. These people forget that there is not only material wealth, also there is spiritual, and that the same can find a poor person who is also a scoundrel, like a rich quite dignity. It is true that a better world is possible, but only you can get when every citizen reject mediocrity is inside himself, because mediocrity of the political class is only the reflection of the mediocrity of the society it represents. Actually, petty people are unhappy because they do not understand that the key to happiness is to live with balance and moderation, do not understand that in the same way that to produce life is necessary to unite earth and water in a balanced way, the same way for that human relationships are fruitful it is necessary to accompany the material desire of wealth with the desire for a life fully developed in the spiritual aspect. You need to understand that the common good is also the good of oneself, and only when you learn to respect the rights of others is being able to live in society. Because a brutish soul, forget the spiritual values, becomes numb and unable to feel, because a man who only takes into account materialism is like a desert lacks water and therefore unable to develop full life. A person will never be happy to get more wealth. These tormented souls find peace only when you understand that to destroy the crust that covers his soul must abandon vanity and return to a humane and fair attitude. Explained from metaphysical point of view, you could say it's like petty people had been displaced in their behavior toward the left side of the electromagnetic spectrum of colors, then on the left side red color representing matter and energy is but also coarseness, while on the opposite side is the blue color representing spiritual values and sensitivity. Therefore, the proper attitude would be located in the medium, where the green color represents the balance between matter and spirit. This intermediate position is the best of both colors, receive the same influence, and so is the generating of life. People desperate spending only toward one of the colors in their emotional aspect, they lose the ability to get the most out of the universal energies, and that they becomes rough in some respects, which makes them unhappy because they refuse to assess all dimensional aspects of the universe. Actually, emotional character and the colors are related. This is because the universe is governed by two main polarities that could be defined as male and female, earth and water, heat and cold, red and blue, matter and spirit, left and right, plus many other examples. This bipolarity of the universe is present in most aspects of our life, and it is useful to know to find the perfect balance in each of the situations. Therefore, those who overvalue the material part of life and undervalue the spiritual, it is as if they were blind and therefore unable to understand the cosmos in perspective. This behavior is what is usually defined as a materialistic personality, and only when the balance is restored life can reach their fullest. A society hypocrite. People complain of the political class that has, but what politicians can be expected to emerge from a degenerate society? This is a society that moves away from the moral belief that it moves away from religious organizations. Do they not know how to distinguish which are two entirely different things? The fact that religious organizations serve religion for evil and acquire power, does not mean that religion is bad. Just that someone uses a weapon to hurt does not mean the gun is bad. Evil will always be on the person and not the means used to express that bad. But this mediocre society attacks religion and moral belief that attacks religious organizations, being that way aimlessly, for every person and every nation need ethical values on which to base their lives and not just mere impulses greed that rule today. You allow your women refuse to have children because they believe it is better to live as men and thus provoke the suicide of your society, and still have the cynicism of saying that there is no problem because the children may have immigrants. Good, how can you be so petty as to destroy your race and your culture and stay so quiet? You do not understand that both are inculcated into your society for millennia values and all you despise? How can you be so naive to believe that some immigrants who in some cases are from companies coming to the Stone Age to be folded without your beliefs or your culture? How can you think that they will respect you if you are not even able to have control over your own borders? Believe chaos and a new Tower of Babel only by greed to exploit these immigrants as slaves, because they only think in commercial production and not people. Ignorant, you are not understanding the true instigators of miscegenation are the powerful and companies seeking to convert the working class into a single mass of slaves. But the most pathetic of all, be precisely the left parties, which both boast support workers, those most in favor. They tell you it's because you collaborate humanitarianism and naively, without realizing to be creating a society of identical slaves to ancient Athens, and to favor all those corrupt politicians linked to businesses. You allow the entry of illegal immigrants, then you miss to get robbed and ownership of social aid for which you have quoted, but now you refuse to give to them. But is it perhaps believed that your actions have consequences? No, you are able to understand that the true humanitarianism is not to promote uncontrolled immigration and miscegenation, but to help people perform at their own land, because migration can only make sense when done legally and among similar companies, to avoid inter alia the lowering of wages and the consequent damage to the working class. You allow your daughters to their boyfriends bring to your homes to sleep and then have the cynicism of saying no problem, because everything can solve the abortion. It is that the word you dignity and life of those creatures that you are going to undo do not have meaning? You claim to be against the drug but give to your children the ways of consuming alcohol before them, stupid phrase saying that this is a good drug. If you had dignity you would reject the consumption of drugs, but not through repression as do the cowards and hypocrites, but by giving the good example of refuse you to consume any type of drug is legal or illegal. You will complain of high rates of crime, but at the same time you stay indifferent when serial murderers sentenced to thousands of years in prison after leaving prison sentence ridiculous, just because they say have repented. Do you think there is some criminal who does not claim this just to get out of jail? Do not you understand that those politicians who call Democrats created those laws that promote impunity only to apply it to themselves? Granted prison leave to the murderers as if the lives of people they would like, do not understand that when a person is in jail is not to do a job, but because it is a danger to society, is folly to allow temporary release a criminal, except in compliance immediately prior to his conviction, when it may make sense a gradual adaptation to the outside world period. You have to understand that these politicians do not care about democracy or citizens, because they do nothing to lie with the sole purpose of getting rich. It is necessary for society to understand that morality is necessary to create a decent society, and there can be no progress in the disorder causing miscegenation, nor may arise a model society of an economy based only on mere commercial production and slavery of the working class. Call prejudice to things that are not, just because you are unable to spend a minimum of your lives to reflect on the world around you. Do not you understand that knowing the truth cannot rely solely on the media, government, or schools? They have their own interests that do not coincide with yours. We must demand and value free time as an effective means to analyze things around us objectively, without conforming with the version of reality that others want us to propose. Culture is not just to remember, but also to reason. If we do not give kids free time to develop their own personality and uncover the lies that teach them how they can discover, calm your conscience by donating money to NGOs, without realizing that many of these organizations are not interested in eradicating poverty, thus essentially are companies for which the poor are only a means of enrichment. You say help the poor, but you have ever worried require managers of these companies they tell you how much money earmarked for their own salaries? That is not humanity, is hypocrisy. Call democracy to a social system in which only the poor pay taxes, for the rich and politicians serve as tax amnesties and other methods to avoid paying their fair share. Politicians refuse to act against companies that defraud the many links they have with them. It would be like find themselves. You let yourselves be carried away by appeals to anger against the opposing parties without realizing that it is just a method to deceive you, for none of them advocates the creation of a genuine democracy in which voting laws and not just games. You will complain of it all, but many of you would do the same if you were in his place. If you have no dignity, as you can demand the same dignity to degenerate political class that represents you. Poor world. Chapter 3, Science. The bad and the instinct causador. Often people wonder whether criminal behaviors are somehow a consequence of the hunter instinct is supposed present in man. For a conclusion would be necessary to understand why hunting occurs in the animal kingdom. In my opinion, one possible reason is that nature by creating predation attempts what is that older animals are removed from the wild before his death occurs. It is that somehow represent predators cleaning services of nature, would be responsible for removing the animals just before he died. If we observe the behavior of lions before hunting, you can see who are always looking for the old, weak, or sick animals, so that hunting them easier, but thus help nature by avoiding that these animals once dead sow the soil of biological remains that can cause infections. It is true that for that are already scavengers, but the difference is that the predator avoids these animals die in a state of extreme biological degeneration to hunt them just before you get to that situation. However, it is also true that without predation, it would not be necessary that the animals had many offspring, because although it is not the intention of nature, not only die older animals because of predators but also greatly the babies. The proof is in the fact that animals lack natural enemies have a number of very small babies. For this reason it is difficult to decide what is the real reason that motivates a predator, if it is an urge to hunt created by nature as a tool for biological cleaning, or rather the opportunist attitude of the hunter who uses the advantage of have a more developed brain or larger to get their food from hunting and not the plant body. Perhaps the answer is that there are animals that hunt instead of eating vegetables simply because they can or find it as acceptable as any other method of feeding. Because it is not true that the most intelligent animals have to be necessarily carnivores, we have proof that the gorilla is intelligent but mainly vegetarian. But what is to compare the behavior of a predator to a criminal animal. There is one thing that clearly differentiates them, is that the predatory animal hunts not because it is bad necessarily, but because your body is designed from the birth to hunt a certain kind of usually prey of other species to be served food. Instead the criminal dominated by arrogance, attacks its own fellows without any valid reason. I refer of course to those who commit crimes on a whim rather than by necessity. Therefore, it can be deduced that the deviation of behavior in the offender has more to do with that with something purely biological moral education. Could we then consider that criminal behavior arises simply from the diversion of hunting instinct to take the criminal for his fellow prisoners? The answer is no, because although it is true that the hunter instinct may be present in all people, only that instinct drives us to seek food to live and not to attack without our own kind. It is true that the hunter instinct that everyone is supposed to have, can act as a supportive means of aggression present in the offender, but that does not mean it can be considered the cause of their behavior. Because the facts show that criminals dominated by vanity, in most cases have the means to live peacefully and yet they do not. Therefore, it can be deduced that although it is true that use their hunting instinct to help them commit their crimes, however, is not the instinct that leads them to commit, but the deviation of their moral behavior. It is true that sometimes health conditions may increase aggression, but you can always ask for medical help or use our own common sense rather than to hurt others. Because the criminal dominated by vanity, you just want to exert power over their fellow men and violating their free will, and that has nothing to do with hunting or disease to survive, but with arrogance. The criminal is primarily a despot, who has developed an antisocial attitude because in childhood showed no limits that should have life in society. At the end, when he reaches adulthood, his personality becomes impossible to change and ends up being the victim of its own degeneration. Evil is primarily the result of an error and an imbalance of behavior that victimizes those who have it as their behavior axis. Because in order to live in society is necessary to know where our rights end and where they begin those of others, therefore it is essential to eradicate vanity in children when this begins, because evil is like a disease of the spirit, and unlike what some to think, there is only one possible attitude, which is let it grow or destroy it completely. Therefore, it is necessary that the punishment is proportionate to the seriousness of the crime, because despots, or conceited person, always seen as a sign of weakness that were not punished enough for their iniquities, and this only helps to increase its despotic attitude. It is necessary to maintain a firm attitude with those who allow themselves to be dominated by this behavior, because only if destroyed evil inside them, the soul can return to normal. We should not forget that above all the first victim of a despot is the same, because vanity prevents him from being happy and away from a life in harmony with society. Therefore, it is necessary to understand that man evolved only have a truly world when you understand that justice should be the focus of their behavior. The way of the spirit. Many people wonder, if the spirit is there, how? In my opinion, the same life that matter is not created nor destroyed, only transformed. Therefore, the present life in our spirit is eternal and is divided into two main parts. The first is a spherical structure formed by material and energy, but different to that. This atomic structure is designed to be inserted inside brain neurons and from there create energy pulses with which to use the body. It is at that moment, when you can truly speak of a cerebrally be alive, and is also the first step in a process of reincarnation. Because in reality, the body is just the machine that the spirit used to be able to manifest in the material world, and only when you take control of it can truly be considered as a human being and not as a mere sum of atoms or molecules. Secondly, the spirit consists of what is usually called phantom or ghost. Actually, a ghost is nothing more than a simple imitation of the body of the deceased, and has been created to make the process of death and rebirth easier, because once the spirit is clear from your body, then normal is that at first did not understand their new situation. For this reason it is planned in advance that when this happens, the spirit be comforted to see that you still have a body, if only apparent way. Specters or ghosts usually are not visible, but in exceptional cases can be. Sometimes it is the spirit that provokes, and sometimes is the result of great sensitivity who sees it. Inside of each particle forms the spirit is the soul and is responsible for that we feel, because you only have life and existence that which has a soul. Actually, the soul and spirit are the same thing, the difference is that the soul only represents the ability of every spirit has to feel, but the spirit instead aspect may vary over time as a result of the process of evolution. It is important to distinguish between a form and a living object, because every object has life, but that life is present only in the matter that composes it, but not in the way shown. Therefore, you can only properly speak of an object or living form, when has a different spirit which coordinates. This is what happens, for example, in living things and man. To put a clearer example, a stone, a machine, or a robot are forms, but lack life. However, it does have life, the subject of atoms or molecules that compose them, but not as distinct, but as part of a higher being that is planet Earth or the universe, i.e. that these forms do not represent an individual being, but only the tip of a being. However, the human body is a shape that does have life, because although it shares the same conditions of the above forms in relation to body composition, however has an own differentiated spirit, conferring thus the qualification of being alive. Then someone might ask, if the planets and stars have their own life, which is his will and as demonstrated free will, The answer is that what we consider logical behavior of a planet can actually be the expression of their own will. So, according to this assumption, if a planet is willing, he could do as a human being and one day to go in one direction and the next day the other way? The answer is no, because the laws that govern the universe are made of a rigid portion and another resilient. This is because otherwise it would be impossible to build a consistent universe that does not contradict at any time. Therefore, in the universe a part of what we do depends on our own will, but another part depends on the natural laws that are constant, have the same for everyone. In the same way the planets and the stars are subject to the same conditions, so a part of their behavior is fixed and constant and a variable. Perhaps a test of the ability to change is the fact that each nebula is different from the others. It is possible that for stars that form it represents the expression of their own will. When the universe began, there was only one particle was divided and led on one side to the spirits and on the other the material universe formed by galaxies. This is because the fact that a particle is not formed by other need not necessarily prevent kin split to create new beings derived from the first or backward merge two particles to form a single. Each being in turn may consist of multiple particles. The difference is that when they are particles of the same will be are linked by filaments that connect directly. However, when the connection is with other beings, then it is indirectly in filaments. The universe in turn could be formed by a single person, or every planet and every star form a single being. This is possible because the size and importance are not the same thing, and although the universe was controlled by a single being, it not therefore has to be more important than the individual spirits, because eventually, all beings have to go through this situation in rotation in other future cosmic cycles. But as regards the will, it is possible that when the universe thinks, what it does is decide how it is organized to evolve in the same way that an engineer has to decide how to improve a device. Clearly some of these changes will decide the physical laws, but another part may be the result of the will of the universe, because as an engineer can choose a design or another, the universe in its progress can also choose from several various possible options, but always within the basic physical laws. We must not forget that the concept of will is not absolute but relative, because if we propose will strictly from a physical standpoint, then someone could say that our actions are not the result of our own tastes but the interaction of matter shape our bodies. So I think it is only fair, considering that both forces are equally true and important, i.e. what we call will is what nature allows us to do without contradicting physical laws. The fallacy of cryonics. It is surprising that in an overpopulated world has who pay money for that in the near future his body can be supposedly returned to life. Do they believe that being able to create life naturally, society will worry about reviving corpses? Actually all it born of materialistic effort to deny the possibility of a spiritual life after death, and therefore associate the continuation of life to the continuation of the body. They are unable to understand that the human body has been created for a limited duration and do not understand that what should survive death is the spirit and not the body. Actually, cryonics is nothing more than a modern form of embalming the body, but equally absurd that the Egyptian mummies, because every human body is built to last a limited time and need to accept this reality. But the craziest thing is like waiting to be revived people who pay fortunes to freeze his body, because in many cases freeze only the head or brain and think in due course a future society will create a cloned being identical to it. Then they extracted his brain, and then introduced his in the body of the clone. This from all points of view would be murder, because the clone, it would be equal to humans, and therefore the same right to live and decide on their own body. Is a serious mistake to confuse old age with a disease, because all that is born must die, everything that is created has to get old, the same people that planets or stars, because the cycle of birth, development and death is a natural and necessary for nature to be recycled. Therefore, the process is necessary to understand that the human body is a machine created for a limited duration, and that what is truly eternal is the spirit that after death must follow its own path in a new reincarnation. Unlike the body, the spirit never had a beginning, because its existence is outside of the cyclic structure of time, because the spirit is life and life as matter is not created nor destroyed, only transformed. Spirit exists as an expression of the opposition between the existence and nothing. Matter and vacuum are eternal events unrelated to time. The spirit or soul may pass through stages, but its nature is derived from the eternal nature of the universe and therefore are eternal like him. There are those who raise the possibility of indefinite survival of the body, saying that some biological forms as trees are much longer than people lives, but keep in mind that the metabolism of plants works in a reverse plane to animals or man. Since plants have a slow metabolism and fast animals, this is the cause of the difference in longevity. A plant remains lifetime in a static situation, so suffers less wear. However, animals are characterized by a much more active and intense life, causing whichever is shorter. It is true that there are some animals like jellyfish that seem immortal, but this is the consequence of their own biological simplicity, because the more complex an organism's reproductive needs to be able to regenerate. The problem is that materialistic people are unable to differentiate the material plane of spiritual. They do not understand that our body is only the instrument used to express our spirit. For it to die must be replaced by another through reincarnation. Because really all there is eternal life, matter in the universe, planets, and galaxies are also alive, only die as it forms adopted by matter, because life is not created nor destroyed, only transformed, and our feelings and our conscience will never disappear because they remain indefinitely through the eternal life of our spirit. In fact, the death of the body gives the spirit the opportunity to live again all experiences as fully through reincarnation, as if each life outside the first, learning and experience are necessary, but in perspective, because it is good to learn but it is also good to forget those things that are no longer useful, because everything has its time and its deadlines, and all the things that need to be transmitted from generation to generation and are transmitted through education and scientific progress. But we live in a cyclic universe, is recycled and regenerated without stopping, as occurs with the limitation on the length of days, seasons, or years, so people like the rest of things around us are made for a limited time, which is eternal is our spirit, which is the common denominator of all that never began or end because it is out of time. Because life represents our spirit is not created nor destroyed, only transformed, because life really is eternal and death is nothing but the end of a cycle, but not the end of life. To lay bare the absurdity of seeking the eternal life of the body, think that those who advocate such a thing also could then propose the eternal life of the rest of the machinery, because deep down our body is a machine but of biological origin. The difference is that our body is governed by a spirit that is the true custodian of eternal life. Because if we gave credence to the myth of gain eternal life to the body that after all is a machine, and that same reasoning to other machines were applied, then people could devote himself to repair them indefinitely until the end of the times. But this hypothesis is absurd, because it is logical that the repairs are made when a device has damaged a minor part of its structure, but when those damages cover most of the apparatus due to natural deterioration, it is best to replace it completely by new one. Here is the reason why the death of the human body makes sense. But this is only the end for our body, which is nothing more than a mere instrument for the demonstration in the matter of our spirit, which may continue in human life until the end of the cosmic cycle through the process of reincarnation. Actually, what people call death is only the change of state of matter. What dies is only the form but not the present life inside it that way, because life in its essence is eternal, the same for humans than for planets or stars. Personality of a psychopath. The main characteristic of a psychopath is that between the desire to do something and do it, the fact there is hardly any difference. Arguably, two factors normally involved in its development. One would be the genetic factor, is characterized especially by giving these people an excess of aggressive acts hindering their own self-control, and the other would be the educational factor, as that a psychopath reach the highest levels of violence is often the result of a lack of attention from adults when it comes to punishing the less desirable behaviors, i.e. if a child had an inclination to evil he is not cut in the early stages, then this attitude will increase to unimaginable levels, as the criminal psychopath was at first a child to his parents, consented to their whims and not adequately punished their excesses. Because the true origin of evil is encouraged or permitted by adults who have the responsibility to teach children a civilized attitude, vanity. For the adult who consents to every whim of the child will have a psychopath per adult, as it is in childhood when the personality is forged, and if a child grows up thinking that all you want you will have to give, by hook or by bad, it will be a misfit in adulthood, and will be forced to fake a gregarious personality and not only show as truth in those situations that he will believe to control. It is true that there may be a genetic predisposition for development of a psychopath, especially as I said to favor with a more aggressive nature than normal, but this is only one factor among others, but does not determine by itself that someone ends up being a criminal. In fact, you could say that for every 100 people born with a psychopathic predisposition, only 10 develop a criminal attitude. The explanation is simple and circumstances that influence a person are many, so if from childhood a person is brought on track, it will be difficult to end up having a criminal attitude. In fact, many people with psychopathic personality can be despots or evil, but without breaking the law significantly. It is therefore regrettable that the laws of some countries' child protection offender not to punish their wickedness confused and do not understand that the fact that their parents did not try hard enough in the education of their children does not prevent these young they were not aware of acting against the rights of others, nor does it change the fact that if they do not correct their evil acts forcefully, they have failed in their duty to make them civilized people. Because the psychopath who commits crimes was a child who committed an act of evil and his parents were so rotten, made another more serious and was sanctioned insufficiently, and it is so bad do nothing as combat evil lukewarm because the scoundrel seen in the warmth an argument to continue in the same attitude. The fact that a psychopath advance in their wickedness up to kill another fellow man is only the result that nobody has arrested at his attitude when his personality was still moldable, and if in adolescence this has not been changed, as an adult will almost impossible to correct. Because evil is necessary to cut the roots, and if you notice that the evil is being developed in a child should respond to that behavior with the same forcefulness that evil that wants to fight, otherwise only strengthen the despotic behavior. Therefore, punishment must be necessary for the scoundrel feel unmotivated to continue in that attitude, and only when you understand that no evil will compensate him. Nor should we forget that it is essential to give the necessary love children, because a child not only needs material food, so emotional needs, and a father who does not give affection has no right to demand anything your child. It is true that many people did not have parents who are desirable and lacked affection or attention needed, but nevertheless were adults exemplary, so it is false to say that a difficult childhood lead to such behavior inevitably, because the fact of having an unhappy childhood does not force anyone to be a scoundrel, because we can always decide what has to be the way forward. Therefore, it can be said that to prevent a child ends up being a psychopath, it is essential that parents do not confuse protect consent, and not allow evil to develop in their children and give them the essential ethical and moral education of these civilized people. And when that responsibility passes to the institutions, fulfill their duty not to repeat the mistake of their parents and teach them good citizenship. It is no better father who consents to the punisher, it is better a reproach to time to let it ruin his life and end up in jail. Because only a hypocritical society in an infinitely lesser penalty applies to a young person who commits a crime with another 17 years who is 18. Could it be that sanity only appears when arriving at 18 and she completely lacks prior to that date? More like a pretext for breaching his duty to do justice. Therefore, it is necessary that both parents and institutions strive to try to eradicate the evil, rather than simply making excuses for doing nothing. It is also unfortunate that many times parents compete with each other using their children, and try to look better with gifts and quirks, inculcating thus evil in them. This is merely a consequence of the age in which we live, in which women try to play the same social roles than their husbands, with the consequence that in the end none is when you need to teach manners to their children, and when they do not dare to prevent this is used by the other against. Maybe it's time to think that quality of life is not only to bring more money home, but pay more attention to the family. There is also what might be called the psychopathy group. This is what happens in some neo-Nazi groups in the Basque and Catalan nationalists, extremists, or destructive cults. These groups are characterized by demanding rights but deny responsibility, acknowledge mistakes of others but always deny themselves, to the point of considering murder as acceptable if it favors their interests. In this case, usually parents themselves are responsible for instilling evil directly to their children, but that does not absolve them of responsibility, for the fact that they inculcate these ideas does not mean they lack the ability to distinguish where their rights end and where those of others begin. These groups are like a magnet for petty despots and people therefore, rather than political parties might be called hypocrites' associations. This kind of individuals intended to hold the government accountable for all their personal problems or family and believe in the right to do whatever they want. They look at the speck in your neighbor's eye, but forget the beam in their own. Nationalist parties give them the excuse to do evil, but evil, and within. Spirit and genetics. Although we all benefit from our body, we really have no knowledge of how it has been designed and built. Currently all that is known about it is derived from the evolutionary theories of Darwin. But this so-called natural selection can only partly explain the mutations or genetic evolution. The mere chance or natural selection cannot explain everything. In my opinion, the design and development of biological organisms is a coordinated task between spirits and natural selection to 50%. In the spiritual world there are laws that govern just as in the material world. One of those laws determines that when organic beings die, that is when the spirit loses its physical body, then the spirit separates from the body and restores the memory of the spiritual plane. Some of these spirits, and probably in rotation, passing time, charge for the task of determining the possible genetic changes that animals and plants need for their progress. The process of natural selection caused by radiation, or sexual voluntary choice, can only explain part of the changes in biological forms, but all the complex changes that require advanced knowledge can only be carried out by the intervention of superior intelligence. Especially in the initial evolutionary phase, in which there is a genetic code in which to build. Therefore, there is much difference between the complexity of the human body and the great intellectual backwardness of the mind that governs it. The human body is practically perfect because it has been created by higher intelligences, but the human mind is the result of technological developments in the material. This difference between the developmental level of the spirit and of the human mind is only temporary until technological progress completes its evolution. It's as if the body were a complex machine, which had been provided by higher intelligences for use and rebirth of our spirit, in order to enjoy the benefits of life in the flat material provided. When the level of human technology is put at the same developmental level of the body, technological progress will be completed in its essential part and man can be truly in harmony with the universe. And the spirit and the body will have reached the same level of knowledge. It could be said that there are two reports, one is relevant to our spirit and another is for the body. Both do not have to be mixed so that both planes do not interfere, and so human life to live more fully. At present materialistic scientists refuse to accept another way of understanding the different theories of Darwin evolution, because they lack the courage to recognize that life there is not only the material plane, but also the spiritual plane. Why not accept another explanation of the physical facts? These scientists talk endlessly about the qualities of matter, but referring to it as an object, but always denying their right to be considered as a being who feels and lives, explained in detail the chemical and nuclear processes or reactions between particles, but they are unable to recognize that all this would not have been possible if the matter had not had life and own conscience, speak lightly about the origin of organic life, affirming that emerged as random combination of matter and energy, but not they realize that it is profoundly stupid to pretend to attribute to matter coherence and organized operation while denying that this matter has life and ability to understand their own existence. You need to understand that this so-called organic life would not have been possible if it had not existed before other life in the mineral plane. That is the true definition of life, is the ability to feel and react by oneself. Therefore, the so-called organic life must be understood simply as a more complex form of organization of life, but without denying that life is derived from an existing one, that is life on the atomic plane or mineral. Because life as matter is not created nor destroyed, only transformed. Everything that has life is eternal, the only thing that changes is how to manifest. Matter is life, what is commonly defined as death is simply changing the way that stuff shown. Death does not disappear this life that matter, but only the way it is presented. Therefore, when an organic life form dies, what occurs is the separation between spirit and body, because life is eternal and death is just changing way life is. So, what dies is the expressed form in matter, but not life present on it. It could be said that a human being is the sum of two different lives, one life is representing the matter of his body and the other is the present life in the spirit that gives meaning to human form. So when a human being he dies, his spirit separates from the body and prepares for a new reincarnation. Thus the human body serves as an instrument for the manifestation of spirit into matter, so they can reach their full realization. Reincarnation of spirits in human form is not a transitional or temporary process, but an end in itself, because the reason for creating biological ways to reach the human form is the fact that it is through reincarnation as reaches maximum happiness. Therefore they reincarnate spirits and expressed through the human form until the end of the current cosmic cycle and the universe begin again. Some people do not believe that the process of reincarnation should be indefinite, but what sense would that nature has taken 4 billion years to create the human form? If it were not for the spirits reincarnate in it until the end of the cosmic cycle, it would be a wasted work. It is a mistake to believe that the evils of the world will last forever or that happiness can be achieved only in another. Therefore we must work for that perfect world a reality. Because the fate of all worlds is to evolve to become perfect, when the error and evil be banished, then an era of peace and humanity will be happy was reached. Oblivion. In the universe the process of learning is as important as forgetting the birth as death. Childhood and adulthood is not only important to reach a goal, but also exciting the process of achieving that goal. For this reason the spirits need to forget each new reincarnation process, because knowledge are important only during the time corresponding to their life cycle, meaning that the learning process is necessary but only to be used during the time corresponding the logical use of that knowledge. The accumulation of knowledge is necessary because without them it would be impossible to aspire to greater progress on the same scale, but in turn forgetfulness is also necessary to live again the thrill of discovery. This is why the ephemeral nature of those who think about getting immortality of the body, they do not understand that life is eternal for all that exists, because the same life that matter is not created nor destroyed, only transformed. So one could say that the only thing that dies or disappears is the way in which the subject is expressed, but without involving the disappearance of life or consciousness that existed in this area. This means that if we refer to the death of our body, right is understood as a separation of the molecules that compose in our spirit, with the disappearance of the human form once the life cycle ends, for which it makes sense keep it that way. The universe is experiencing a continuous process of repetition, or what is the same from oblivion, because at the end of each cycle begins again. There are larger cycles and smaller cycles, there are cycles corresponding to seconds and cycles that last a lifetime of universe. A human life is a life of the universe in miniature, as there is great similarity between them. Therefore, we can say that small cycles as human life whose function is interleaved with a larger cycle that is the life of an entire civilization, because civilization as a person also goes through the stages of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. When it ceases, the great process of technological development and greater social stability is reached. At that moment the man reaches truly be consistent with the universe, and can expect to live a truly happy life, a civilization which can last as long as the life of the universe. The architecture of the cosmos. At first, in the cosmos there was only a matter particle. This particle has always existed and always, since its existence is born opposition vacuum, i.e. matter is the opposite version vacuum, or what is the same thing nothing, but nothing cannot exist by itself, if not as mirror image of the subject. Therefore the matter and void are the same but in reverse, male one and a female as a first version of the sexes and the magnetic poles. The first particle has size, he cannot be compared with anything is to define that size, not have time, because time is the result of displacement of material particles in a logical scale for changing events. Therefore, since there are only a particle not changing events, the first particle can be defined as a perfect sphere of material surrounded by a vacuum. From this moment the particle happen to be divided successively into individual particles, and these particles in turn are divided into two categories. Some would be particles that maintain a direct connection between itself, and other would be those which would not have such direct connection. Which maintain direct connection could be defined as particles themselves, an individual being or spirit, and would not have a direct connection form different spirits. That is, it is as if the first beings clone themselves, just as cause cells to divide. That means that from this moment share the same last but not the same future. The direct connection of the particles that form a single one may be formed by filaments of indivisible material linking the keeping a rotational movement to the speed of light particles. This rotational movement would aim to avoid interference between the material filaments that would connect particles together. By this rotational movement these filaments could collide and exceeded without losing any of its direct to surround each connection. This nevertheless system is only a hypothesis and fit other ways of raising the weight to save the direct connection the particles and their relationship to the other. That is, there may be a plane in which the particles would be expressed in a different space and to hold together the particles although separated form one being. Therefore, all those particles belonging to a single person would be connected together directly by these filaments material or other connection mode. This applies to all particles even photons of light. Matter of the cosmos is life, and this life is eternal, because the matter is not created nor destroyed only transformed. Once that first particle multiplied and divided into different beings and different particles within each being, it spent planning the universe began with the Big Bang which subsequently led to the formation of galaxies. Beings would become the planets and stars and others who would be the majority, they would be reincarnated on planets as organic beings. It is also possible that all the planets and stars actually form a single being and therefore the rest of beings reincarnated as a whole and the worlds built for it. This being that formed the planets, stars, and all matter not pertaining to individual spirits not God, for God is actually the sum of all beings in the cosmos and the laws that govern it. These universal laws do not belong to any being but to all because all have contributed to creating them. The fact that a being reincarnated so to speak as a planet and another as mere ant, does not mean that one has an absolute value greater than the other, because throughout the many cosmic cycles all beings personify all lives and all papers, as if one being lived all time events but each time representing a different life. Therefore God can only be what is common, what unites us and defines us all, and all participate as appropriate in each situation needed to build the cosmos. Sometimes live as planets, and other most of the time as people, because there are many more some than others. Well, actually the purpose of the planets is to represent the scenario in which people can develop their life experiences. Because actually the reason for the construction of this universe as it is to create the human form as this is the ideal place for beings reach the fullness of their realization and their greatest happiness shape. Once beings reincarnate, momentarily forget their past as builders of the cosmos, in order to fully immerse themselves in human life without interference from the past, and thus live life more fully. Once the universe ends its current existence, all galaxies will meet and gather in one sphere of matter, and all beings and all the particles return to the original point. Even photons of light from space come back in a circular path until end at the same point they left, then the particles and beings begin to merge until returning back to the original particle precursor of time and space. Once again there is only one particle will eventually start again and history he repeated, but beings live in this new cosmic cycle a different role in this cosmic history, i.e. the time is repeated but each being exchanged their roles, until once interpreted all be repeated again the same time. Thus, the time will be over its root. Arguably, it's like one being represented all the lives and experiences, but living in each cosmic cycle only one of them, i.e. the time in a more absolute sense not begin again until all beings have lived all lives and experiences possible. This means that when a being sees another, you are actually seeing what he was in his past, but also what will be in your future. Therefore, although the history of the universe repeat the same from a material point of view, however our souls exchange their papers to live different lives they lived in the previous cosmic cycles and the definitive beginning of time will not be met until this wider cosmic cycle has not been completed. The fact that time repeats the same in each new cosmic cycle does not prevent the free will of beings, for what is repeated is what we decided to do freely, it is a repetition of time and not a repetition of events conditionally. That would be something quite different. Therefore, there would be two wheels or cycles of events in the cosmos, one would be material historical facts, and another would be to the souls that were exchanged at the end of each cosmic cycle, living this way each all experiences possible in the universe. These filaments that would connect the material particles characteristic of a single being, probably would move circularly in the same way that the magnetic lines between the north and south of the provided particles of magnetic field's poles and would be synchronized to the speed of light the rest of the particles, so that at the time when the collision between two lines of force without touching these may be exceeded by surrounding the one to the other was given. It is also possible that the friction between the material particles lines connecting the cause of gravitational forces, creating a light pressure on the collision point before exceeded. That undulating movement of these materials filaments could also help explain the wave nature of electromagnetic particles. It could be said that the matter would consist not only particles, but also by these material lines that would connect the particles following the path north to south and magnetic fields and the speed of light. These materials filaments would behave in a similar way as you would a chain in mechanical connecting its entirety gear, but without transmitting force necessarily, and one of the most striking attributes is that regardless of the distance that separated particles form a being, any contact used in one of its particles or filaments as if it were in the whole particles or filaments would form being. This is possible because these filaments that would connect the particles would not turn formed by other particles but would be more like the extension of the primary material but elongate in its interior as it would be formed by the core or void, as preferred call, which is the opposite side of the subject, and being a single unit communication whole being would be instantaneous, regardless of the distance that separated its entirety. It is also possible that the spirits use the magnetic lines that connect the planets together to move between them, thus tied so to speak to these magnetic lines could travel at the speed of light in a similar way to how a passerby would rise between two floors by an escalator. This could be useful in the event that humanity succeed in creating colonies in the worlds around us. Then the spirits that now would live as plants or animals on Earth definitely leave that and would move to these planets to reach human form that is the true goal of evolution. Then the Earth would attend the end of the biological backward forms and all animal forms disappear, even viruses and bacteria. This does not happen by removal of these species, but their spirits have the opportunity to migrate to the human form in these new planets for colonization, which would be the real objective of nature. From this moment the production of oxygen or food would be totally artificial, which does not mean it worse than those produced by plants, because the shape of the world that previously would know is only a temporary situation until the man reaches the possibility carried out completely and be self-sufficient. Times and space. On our planet we are used to the fact that the day lasts 24 hours, but few people will wonder how times on other planets and satellites when they habit humans. The problem is that each planet has a different rotation period and therefore our system equivalent to 24 hours day would not be possible in them. There are planets where a day equals 200 Earth days, so it would be impossible to equate a human 24-hour day to a rotation of the planet on its axis. One of the methods that could be used to fix it would be to use a single schedule for the entire planet, and thus passing the disadvantages of adapting to different times when traveling to another part of the planet would be avoided. Another method would resemble as much as possible times of that hypothetical planet human time clock. For example, on a planet whose day were equivalent to 12 hours could make a human day were equivalent to 2 rotations of the planet, so the day would always begin with sunrise and end with the start. Just like on Earth, the only difference is that this would happen twice in 24 hours, or what is the same thing, twice in a human day. You could also do the same on planets whose day were equivalent to 8 hours, in this case the only difference is that a human 24-hour day equivalent to 3 rotations of the planet, but this way a human day always begins synchronized with the period rotation of the planet. In my opinion it is better this type of system rather than a single schedule for the entire planet, because its sometime homogeneity is maintained, by keeping constant the people who are awake or asleep at the same time, which is useful for things like communication with other planets. In addition, I think it is nicer to use synchronization with the rotation of the planets, because it makes better use of daylight hours. Actually, there are many planets that are similar to our own times or can be synchronized with him to miss this circumstance. Another method that could be used would be to adapt the human schedule full to the planet's rotation, i.e. in the case of living on a planet that had a 12-hour day, people would wake 8 hours and sleeping 4 in each rotation. In my opinion, this would be the wrong approach, because it respects the natural way of life of 24 hours, and it makes no sense to use it, when there are other methods if they respect. However, in those planets whose rotation period was between 20 and 30 hours if this system would be acceptable, because within these ranges living life could be similar to the Earth. Some people think that technology can provide everything, but such a thing is absurd, and in regard to adaptation to the planets, is the man who has to adapt to them and not the other way around. Therefore, I believe wrong hypothesis install plant on their surfaces to try to produce oxygen and make their breathable atmospheres, because in most cases this is impossible to realize, since the end of its climatic conditions there are also several worlds they not even have. Therefore, man must create their own environment, tailored to your needs, but without trying to force the planets to be like the Earth, as each world has its own characteristics. For this reason the cities of the future will be more like spaceships, that what we are accustomed to thinking that has to be a city, they will have to be prepared to accommodate human life totally different from the climatic conditions on Earth. This does not mean that the worlds of the future are not going to be parks or similar areas. Yes, that will be, but this will not be necessary to transform an entire planet, but is achieved through the creation of protected areas by domes, which it can create within an ideal microclimate for human life, while outside, the planet will retain its natural qualities. Methods of time adjustment discussed above are suitable for living on the surface of planets, but this is not the only way we can live in them because there is also the possibility of living in their orbits at a close distance. This would be possible by installing space cities in an orbit in which orbit the planet coincide with the human ideal 24-hour period. These spatial cities form a chain in the equatorial zone that would cover the entire circumference of the planet. This would allow the construction of a ring-shaped tube around. With the construction of this ring, protection of cities would ensure against the risk of impacts caused by meteorites, and also the loss of propulsion gases produced by ships. To navigate inside between cities would be avoided. This structure would actually consist of 3 rings. One would be the center, which would contain space cities and widened sphere shaped around them. They also have 2 others, one above and one below, for displacement of small ships. These 2 smaller rings would be located about 10 kilometers away from the main ring and would be used for rapid movement between space cities. The ships that moved inside her could generate a light-speed gravity which would more comfortable journey to your destination. Opt for this system, the length of day would coincide with the ideal 24-hour period on all planets for colonization, so it would be like being on Earth. It is possible that this system becomes considered ideal in the future, but nevertheless has the disadvantage of being necessary to bridge the gap between the planet and space cities each time you want to descend to the surface, which means a significant expenditure energy. Artificial intelligence. Many people wonder if robots will one day become like people. The truth is that our body is in many ways like a robot and many of its functions are performed automatically. One might even say unequivocally that our body is a biological machine. However, there is one thing in which a robot and a person can never be equal, and is the existence of the spirit. Because our body is actually a machine set by nature in the service of our spirit, and the spirit, which makes it a living thing, not the shape or own automation of a robot. No matter how many circuits will be set or how resembles in appearance, because a robot could only be as a person if he is prepared to host a spirit. This is what biological form is called reincarnation. It is the spirit that gives us the ability to feel or improvise itself of living beings. The material forming a robot can react or feel, but only as a result of this life in chemical or physical elements of that machine, but may not be aware of itself, as an individual, because it lacks the differentiation means having a spirit inside, as with animals or humans. Then someone might ask, if it would be possible to use the form of a robot to house a spirit. This hypothesis seems absurd, although not impossible, because there is no point in trying to make a human being artificially when nature has given us a perfect body, which is the result of millions of years of evolution. Some say that a robot could be better than men in some respects, but we must not forget that specialization in one aspect involves the loss of specialization in another, and the human being is the best version of what our spirit needs. It is to be his instrument to the presence in the material world and not for casual things, because that already have machines or robots aimed at distance. Our body was created to allow the presence of the spirit in the material world and thereby achieve maximum happiness, therefore, must be an instrument able to fit everything into perspective. Our body must be what it is, with its own limitations, because other issues already have the technology. Safe house. We live in a world where natural disasters such as earthquakes, hurricanes, or floods, frequently ravage mankind. But humans often react passively to a surprisingly it. When these disasters occur, people in some cases limited to curse God and others to pray with effusion simply waiting for him to solve. However, they do not realize that natural phenomena are not the real cause of their misfortunes but human stupidity, which is unable to foresee the consequences of their own actions. For example, in the case of land frequently hit by earthquakes or hurricanes, man always strives to build houses of brick or wood even knowing how vulnerable they are in these situations. It would be much simpler and safer than all the buildings in seismic zones have their beams and columns made of metal, with elastic attachment points, to better adapt to the movements that cause earthquakes. Small homes could be built the same way, it being used for walls and beams made of aluminum or plastic, more resistant to vibration than brick. In the case of gushes lands by hurricanes, it would be desirable to construct the housing in a semicircle, to prevent the effect of high wind speed. This type of construction would be more necessarily expensive and could be manufactured using a plastic dome or aluminum with a hollow chamber therein, once installed would be filled with concrete to give strength. With this simple and streamlined, the wind would not cause the slightest damage to the structure. In the case of floods, usually the man's own ambition in his desire to occupy land, causing the disaster, to endeavor to build houses too close to rivers. We should consider the example of those primitive tribes living in skin tents at these earthquakes did not cause them any concern, however current citizens more prepared technically yes, it is necessary not simply curse the elements or pray, because we can always use our own intelligence to solve the problem. Because this is not just an economic issue, in this case as in many others it is skill than strength. Chapter 4, Philosophia. The mind over matter. Today we live in an era of debauchery in which it seems that only care about the stimulus yes, no ethics or moral. But people forget that intellectual progress is only possible when the mind that directs emotions rather than acting only guided by opportunistic impulses. An example is the case of homosexuality, because it is not the same allow the promotion is not the same respect that support, because although it is fair to respect the inclinations of others when it concerns exclusively private life, that does not mean that is good about it, and therefore does not mean it should be supported, let alone funded by public institutions. We must not forget that it was nature that created the sexes, with the intention that combine each with its opposite, therefore pretend otherwise can only be regarded as an aberration. It is true that because of or genetic faults psychological causes some people do not feel identified with the sex they were born, but bear in mind that evolution is precisely to combat aberration rather than promote, therefore, in those cases in which the body has been defined sexually well, but the person is not satisfied with their sex, it is logical to seek ways to bring that psychological identification is lacking consistent with the sex to which they belong instead of going against nature. It is meaning that it makes little sense to look for chemicals and hormones to make a man well-defined look like a woman, when it would be more logical to look for chemicals that make you feel you emotionally satisfied with the sex they were born. It is true that some people are born without a well-defined sexuality, but is false the belief that being born with the body of one sex and another's mind, what actually happens is that they are weakly oriented sex they were born, that is close to a neutral point. The problem is that since there is stronger psychology sexual nature and when someone decides that feels more identified with the opposite sex with that itself can weigh more than logic, until the end of the absurd, and you can count more whim than reason. It is necessary in this case a gesture of humility and not try to go against nature, with the barbarity of homosexuality and transvestism, because when a person realizes that his body is not as well done as it should be, their duty is try to bring you what you need to complete what is missing, rather than committing aberration carry out serious surgical operations which destroy a body that was almost perfect and move to turn it into a monster, because however much they deny it they have a man's body like woman. It is true that even going the right way, these people have to live their whole lives without feeling completely satisfied with the sex they were born, but it is equally true that always will be happier if they act in harmony with nature if away from it. Because if it works to operate a man who wants to look like women, why not then collaborate to operate to a man who wants to look like an animal? Or those who want to have sex with animals. The mind must be above the body and not get carried away by opportunistic impulses, and if we are aware that our body has an imperfection, should try to fix it headed toward the path that nature has, which is simply to accept the sex they were born. But in this current era, political opportunism incite debauchery, just to get a handful of votes, they propose to encourage all outrages, no matter the least dignity. In addition, feminism has come to further aggravate the problem. It proposes an image of man so pitiful that those women who have a weak sexual orientation end up definitively rule out finding a partner of the opposite sex, ruining thus his chance to be mothers and raise a family, or at least to do so in harmony with nature. Of course, it would be different if a person was born with the sexual organs of both sexes fully developed. In this case, would be best to wait for it reaches adulthood and then decide what sex you want to belong. Actually, homosexuality begins in childhood, and arguably its origin is mainly due to psychological causes, lack of sexual definition that have children in their early years. It is as if they were neutral from the emotional point of view at that time. The problem comes when a child has to take the decision to take as their own sex. Who is born in this very delicate moment can intervene emotional or psychological rather than their own sexual nature factors. Then it may happen that you consider most interesting the characteristics of the opposite sex as yours, is when it tends to think that their sexual orientation is abnormal, when in fact his own attitude that determines it. That is better understood. Arguably, homosexuality only begins when a child acquires prejudices their own sex and commits no real sound reasons to identify itself as sex opposite. The original reason may be simply that in his early years, where sexual orientation is weak, could have better friends than friends or some similar circumstances to make him look more interesting than his opposite sex. That is the problem. Start with the lack of sexual orientation that is common to all children in their first years of life and end when these to identify themselves with the wrong sex, because a purely psychological question, caused by the idea of child consider more interesting defined as women rather than as a man. All this because at that initial moment psychological factors may outweigh their own sexual nature, because in that instant sexual characteristics are underdeveloped. That is all that you see and hear in those early years can lead you to have an attitude of prejudice and rejection of their sex and opposite overvaluation. Wrong as triggers this abnormal sexual attitude. The trouble is that once this attitude is assumed, the character is organized around it, and thereafter is increasingly difficult to change their way of seeing things, because as more time passes the more it moves away from behavior that would correspond to have their own sex, and more hardened character becomes about that attitude. From that moment it tends to adopt an effeminate attitudes and roles that are considered typical of women, which is a result of a voluntary choice that has nothing to do biology, but much human stubbornness. The spirit must dominate matter and mind must dominate the body. Consider as valid a sexual relationship between same sexes like turning the abomination norm. We live an era of debauchery that no freedom, where politicians encourage us to make all the excesses and all immoralities as they are enriched with public money. It is now fashionable to say that if a child says he wants to be a child, parents should work with it, and if you ask hard is because it is true and it is a matter of birth. But if that were so, why not do I say every time the child asks for something earnestly? Every parent knows that to properly educate a child is sometimes necessary to refuse to accept their demands by very angry that this goes down, because the love of a father to his son is shown holding firm to their whims. I do not pretend here that the severity is always the only solution, because the child is a human being and must take into account their feelings, but it is true that the best parent is one who simply engages to accept all the demands of their son, because it is often the best way is to sacrifice and not the mere condescension. Today there are those who turn to history to support these degenerate practices. It is true that in ancient Greece was encouraged or tolerated homosexuality, but bear in mind that the context in which it happened was really unusual and even traumatic. For example, in Spartan society from the age of 7 it was common for men to live apart from women in prison, almost military regime. because it was thought that this was necessary to maintain their customs and social privileges. This situation was easier than homosexual behavior than it would have been in a normal population were developed. Sparta authorities probably ended up accepting homosexuality among men, rather than allow its militaristic system was rejected by the soldiers, because the system hindered normal relations between men and women, mobilized them for long periods of time. It is therefore a serious mistake to use as an example of a healthy customs of the ancient Greeks' sexual behavior, considering that in the case of Sparta whole militaristic system was in order to enslave their neighbors the Helots, but he ended up turning the Spartans themselves slaves to their own customs. It is true that Sparta had many admirable things, but the way they treated his men, with no choice in life than being mere pawns military, left much to be desired. The truth is that the sudden collapse of Sparta was because its social system became fragile and unstable to rely increasingly in a minority of conceited citizens who believed omnipotent, while most despised their own peers. They ended up becoming such a degenerate society that ended up thinking that the male was all important. For a society that fosters homosexuality in order to keep men dedicated only to militarism and war, is obviously a sick society and therefore can be considered fair and deserved his disappearance. Currently the closest thing there is, as regards the situation living the Spartans, is the prohibition that has the Catholic Church to allow marriage to its members. This cruel practice has led this organization it has finished turned into an unfortunate gay ghetto. This shows that should not be confused discouraged to ban, because the fact that one thing deemed wrong, does not imply the right to prevent it by force. When that exclusively concerns the private life of each man must always have the right to discover the truth for himself, respecting their right to be wrong. But in the same way, nor should collaborate with what is considered wrong, but respect the right to do so. Tenderness of poverty. This title does not mean to say in any case that poverty is desirable, because all living wishes logically prosper. What I want to emphasize is the fact that every human being has been created to be part of a gear which is the world. This means that the true concept of happiness is that a person has those things that really need to be happy, as home, family, and enough to keep them in dignity, resources. If we study the lives of some wealthy people, we see that often had unhappy childhoods, and lacked the essentials of life. Therefore, we can deduce that the great effort that had to monopolize economic resources was an act of fear of return, the same situation as a real need. At other times the craving for hogging is due to the fact of having a brutish personality, because despots people still have large financial means are incapable of being happy, because vanity makes dull the spirits to feelings of happiness. It is desirable that governments would create a system covering both labor and health, which would guarantee workers who can never find unassisted, thus the fear of poverty vanish and wages will go closer. True wealth is to be found in the happiness of all, and not on some, because there is no better way to ensure the continuity of private enterprise to ensuring that workers are not left disadvantaged when they lose their job. Indeed, the virtue of the poor is their ability to get through your imagination that you cannot get materially and at the time of prostration when the mind can travel the universe, because the brain is the best and most powerful tool that man has. Because through meditation can enhance intelligence and draw conclusions for better living. Actually, a man does not need huge mansions to be happy, because wealth and happiness are not directly related. Of course it is desirable progress, but progress to consider common sense and equity as its core values. At present people complain about the low morals of their politicians, but it is important to stress that low moral character is merely a reflection of the moral level they represent. Therefore, it is essential to make an examination of conscience before to judge, as an immoral society only leads to a degenerate political class. It is true that politicians try to manipulate public opinion with lies, but it is also true that if citizens had a strong ethical and moral principles would not be possible. If we ask this question from a metaphysical point, one could say that wealth and poverty actually represent male and female values of the universe. Wealth can represent wealth, but also stress. Poverty may represent lack, but also quiet. Therefore, we should not judge things easily, because both aspects of life can be just as necessary, in the right measure. Know how to manage resources is an art, it is therefore necessary to strive to make the most of the least and thus convert poverty into wealth, because it is not happier who more money has but at best also manages thereby unnecessary costs are avoided. It is a pity that in schools the importance of knowing how to manage what you have, because of that many young people come to 40 years living at home with their parents because they are unable to save to buy their own home cannot teach. These young people are despots who only think about the present and want their parents keep them for nothing. But that is also a deserved punishment for parents who did not care at the time to teach civics to their children nor to take responsibility for their own actions. You need to understand that saving today who will benefit from your savings tomorrow, so it's worth learning to manage what we have. The myth of Adam and Eve. In fact, the myth of Adam and Eve is derived from intuit that the universe is divided into masculine and feminine forces. An example of this are the magnetic fields, the relationship between the sun and earth or day and night. Therefore it is necessary to give each thing its just measure and recognize that different religious beliefs are full of imaginary myths but with a certain degree of truth, therefore, is a serious mistake to take the Bible to the letter scriptures. Actually, organic life on Earth began when the spirits of existing beings on this planet began working to build the bodies in which being able to reincarnate, because just as pure energy has no ability to express force if it is not combined with matter, just as the spirits that are mainly energy need a material body in which being able to express, this is due to the large number of events that the embodiment provides. For the matter of our bodies as well as planets and stars are independent living, because the planets and stars are also being inorganic alive, and it is this ability to act independently when combined with our spirits produce the wide variety of unforeseen events that makes life exciting, the fact to live in an environment not completely dominated by us as well as the ability to forget, have benefit of being able to live again the same emotions, as occurring for the first time. Is that feeling of feeling fragile in a mortal body in a universe that acts on its own what makes it interesting reincarnation. In this case the bipolarity of the cosmos is also demonstrated, for the spirit represents immortality and energy, and our body's mortality and matter. Therefore, the fate of our spirits are reincarnated indefinitely in the world and live the many events that the universe can provide us. This will be especially exciting when the world ends its evolution and wars are totally rejected, when the man understands that the world should be subject to a life based on morality and decency. When organic life began on earth, the first task of the spirits is us, because we are also part of God, was to create the first cells capable of asexual reproduction. At this stage of evolution Darwin's theories know they could act because there was no organic life that could be supportive, and life did not arise by chance. It was necessary to design consciously those first living cells which although small have a highly complex task lasted several thousand years trial and error until the first cell playback capability be finished. This is because for spirits was also something new and they did not know for sure what was the best route to take, and for them evolution was as complex as an engineer is developing a machine. From there it was easier then because there was only creating sexual reproduction, which was of great importance, as it allowed the spirits and reincarnated mold his body at will by selecting partner, i.e. each time a specimen choose your partner determines the qualities they will have their children, given that natural radioactivity produces a slight modification of DNA from time to time. In this simple way the genetic progress does not require complicated procedures or intervention of spirits. This is what it is called natural selection. The road to the light. We are continually saturated with messages that we are promised the truth. Politicians, writers, journalists, contacted, religious, channelized, seers, many of them try to come between light and pretending to tell us what the truth is. But in the worlds in the process of evolution as our own truths and lies are always mixed and there are no political parties or individuals who possess the whole truth, therefore, often scammers cause with lies a sense of urgency in citizens to bend to their intentions without thinking calmly their statements, sometimes simply flatter his vanity, telling them all the virtues belong to them and all faults are others. This is what they usually do. Destructive cults and nationalist parties, so hatred among people always blaming everything else, but without acknowledging any own fault, and if this is not enough use intimidation, claiming that the irremediable evils occur if they refuse to submit to them. These despicable beings only seek money or inflate their own ego at the expense of others. Therefore, the only safe solution to keep the right rudder on the path of our life is to always keep the doubt as our main defender, even doubt that what we believe, because the truths of today are tomorrow's lies, because science always has a habit of putting everything into question just a few years after an idea is implemented. Only when man understands that the path to the light requires its own efforts, and that the solution is always to keep doubt as its main backer, only then will be able to out of the way these scammers and can continue safe to light. The child care. We live in a materialistic society where it seems that only takes into account obtaining money. Adults fight over who has the most outstanding workplace and forget that childcare is also an essential part in the quality of life. Feminism speaks a lot about children's rights, but also denied the right to have his mother long enough in the early years of his life to pose as a priority for women competing with men in the world labor. This is a hypocritical way of thinking about motherhood. Forget to give a good child care is not just about getting money, but the dedication of parents is also necessary. Good attention to the adult must be a child again, and through games guide the child in its development, should be through the friendship between parents and children as the child ascends from ignorance to knowledge. Playing with children is good therapy for them but also for adults, because for a moment let's forget these problems of life. A child needs to grow material for heat, but also needs spiritual warmth loving parent represents. Parents should be the best guardians of the child, and for this reason it would be appropriate that mothers had jobs at most half a day, at least while the kids were little, to thus reconcile childcare with working life away from home. This should not be seen as discrimination, because it was nature in its great wisdom that decided to separate the sexes. Not one is worse than the other, but that each sex specializes in a different task with which improve quality of life. Governments should take into account this reality and thus ensure new employment for all workers if they have to lose. In this way they would be better protected those marriages in which only one member has a job. For a good education is also necessary to understand that is not the same study to learn and that a child can progress. The study cannot consist only in memorizing books, since only through the reflection of what is studied is you can understand the meaning of things and find any errors or contradictions that they exist. It is necessary to respect the child's free time so you can develop your own personality. Child's education should not be based simply on memorizing books, but its main function should be to teach the child to reason and learn what disagree about it if it sees fit. It is also important that parents are aware of the moral education of the child, i.e. to ensure that the conduct of this not diverted to despotism or vanity. Therefore, it is essential that parental care includes an element of punishment if the child deviates from civilized behavior, but also reward other hand, if it behaves correctly. Because it makes no sense to pretend punish a child for his evil deeds, while at the same time is not rewarded for good. Just the right balance between the two is right. Because a parent does not give affection to a child, she does not have right to demand anything. So when it comes to judging criminal or improper conduct of a child, the responsibility must be demanded both the child and his parents. Lying and man. Unfortunately, throughout history man has often resorted to lying as a means to achieve their ends. Sometimes religious leaders also have to give more strength to his speeches or selfishness. Therefore, it is fair and necessary to doubt the alleged contacts of these religious leaders, divine or superior entities as they claim to have had. Because really do not need contact with superior beings to have divine inspiration, because that inspiration comes from the ability of each can understand the great values of the universe and does not require necessarily the advice of superior beings, but if that aid it produces, even better yet. But divine inspiration is actually the fruit of the sacrifice of the philosopher, linking intelligence with dedication to the cause of the search for truth. It is therefore regrettable that arise organizations like the Catholic Church that seeks to monopolize the truth and attribute it or communication with God, thus sequestering freedom of thought citizens. In the end, this organization has abandoned its duty to serve society to become a mere instrument of Satan. Now it is a destructive cult formed largely by homosexuals who entertain children while violating seek to dominate the world. They are worth the argument of faith in order to prevent citizens to reason, and with that intention proclaim the infallibility of the Pope, but only a fool would claim that faith must be against the right to think freely about the nature, the universe, or the truth of the divine facts. Eventually and reluctantly, the Church has tried to pretend that opposes child abuse, but neglect is undeniable, the little forcefulness laying on punishing offenders. Clearly the man of the future will need to get rid of these organizations, pursue only profit, and therefore must create a new philosophy that proclaims as an essential axis of the right to dissent and free thinking so much about human affairs and on the divine facts, as man, when he begins to think, awakens the creative and divine part that keeps within his soul. Today it is impossible to prove that part of the religious books are true and which are simply the fruit of the imagination of its authors, however still believe that this is so. That does not mean there is no value in these books, because in the background religion is philosophy, and philosophy is the science devoted to trying to explain the fundamentals of the universe from a metaphysical or spiritual standpoint, therefore, still believing that part of the contents of these books is invented. That is no obstacle to assess the metaphysical and philosophical part of them, but of course rejecting the dogma and proclaiming the right of all citizens to assess the content of these books freely, in order to find the truth. Unfortunately, the naive people think it's the same appearance than reality. He believes that the fact that someone is proclaimed religious implies necessarily make it right, but do not understand that God allows this contradiction precisely for humanity to learn to reason and is set on facts and not on appearances. Babylon the Great's mother fornicators, on that has become the Church of Rome, pacts with many nations only by greed against God. But sooner or later judgment will come and will be banished from this world, that filthy sect given over to evil. Someday man will understand that you do not need intermediaries to find God, we can all find the light through our own efforts, and when the world understands, a new era will be reached. Jesus' death. Many people wonder how it is possible that Jesus gave his life willingly for their cause, especially considering that at that time he could not tell if his preaching would succeed. In fact, this did not occur until several centuries after his death. The truth is that Jesus probably not his preaching as something that had only one possible end, surely would live for many years to spread his teachings, was raised. The problem is that when something drives you strongly to go ahead, is willing to take the risk necessary to achieve this, especially if we consider that life is short and in those times. This means that it is logical to consider that Jesus' never death was raised as a goal in itself. But when he realized that to achieve their ideals could not avoid refused, because what's the point of life if in exchange for giving up what excites you, Jesus did not want to die, but faced this convinced fact, give his life for what flattered him. At the end of the everyday people die in simple accidents without this implying a profit for the good of humanity, then why could not he risk his life to bring a message of coexistence that promotes social progress? The truth is that when you have an illusion that dominates you completely, is willing to take a risk to get it, and in the case of Jesus there was also the added factor of being disconnected from society around him, i.e. his task preaching was primarily an attempt to explain his discovery and try to share with all the light he had found, wished fervently that others could see what he saw and so be one with others. Perhaps he thought that a life without engaging tell this message that he both excited him was not worth living. So sometimes the bravest is not the one that has value, but it has less to lose, because it is always better to risk death to defend the dignity to live without it. 2. Wealth. In the universe there are two forms of wealth, it is the material and one is spiritual. The material is based on obtaining money and material things, and spiritual is based on enrichment as a person. It is regrettable that often the inordinate desire to obtain material objects causes the sacrifice of spiritual wealth. Can happen that a person is rich in money but poor in dignity and spiritual values. This situation is not at all irrelevant, because it is through the proper balance between the two forms of wealth as man can be happy. For that person to get money sacrificed, their dignity can become rich, but at the same unhappy time, because the despot and devoid of spiritual values man becomes incapable of feeling. It is therefore necessary to develop the two forms of wealth, i.e. it is okay to progress in the material aspect of life, but this is in contradiction to a dignified life rich in spiritual values. Because make no mistake, the material wealth does not guarantee happiness, only makes possible a life based on justice and common sense. When a person justice is presented as the core of his being, causes your mind focus and become more effective, not having to worry about the consequences that an unworthy life can have. At that time discover the many things you can do when it comes to obtaining happiness through science, technology, and peaceful life. False myths. Of all the sects that have existed, without doubt the most contemptible are those that are based on evil as the main factor. They do not understand that those who have evil as the core of their behavior has a weak and unstable foundation upon which sustain, since those who base their lives on the wrong end up alone and bitter, for man needs empathy with their peers to be happy. Some of these sects are based on the use of the biblical writings as an excuse to defend their arguments, but with this attitude all they show is their profound ignorance, because the biblical writings are mostly a collection of ancient myths and beliefs created with immoralizing or cultural purposes, but mostly formed by fabricated stories. It is therefore a serious mistake to use biblical or religious to the letter written, because the further back you go back in time, more inaccurate stories that are more stories and fables that seem authentic historical facts. For primitive man trying to understand the world around him, but he had no means to do so, creating fictional stories that mixed with the real facts to fill those gaps, did not understand. A clear example is the story of Lucifer, the fallen angel. This story is not a fact and aims to teach the importance of never trust excessive success, because often the success and failure are closer than it seems. Of all know many people who have achieved a certain notoriety and badly stopped by overconfidence in their success. Another example of the same story but more contemporary is the legend of Icarus, who wanted to reach the sun with wings made of wax, but as they approached the heat melted and fell. So in the story of the biblical fallen angel, the quality that is attributed to be bright and virtuous should be understood that was before his fall, and not as an innate quality as would have us believe those who idolize, because in doing such a thing distort its true meaning. Consider for example in so many stars of music and film, that after achieving fame and wealth yet died young from a drug overdose. The moral teaching of these stories is that not because we must succeed corrupt our soul or believe this will last indefinitely, because if we do not act with enough wisdom and common sense all may be lost. Dragon defeated by San Miguel. And war was in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not over, and no longer found his place in heaven. And it precipitated the great dragon, that old serpent, the devil, and Satan, the deceiver of the universe, was called. He was thrown to the ground, and with his angels were thrown. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now has come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, because it was the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night. They overcame him under the blood of the Lamb and by the word of which testified, despising their lives to death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea! Because it down to you the devil filled with great wrath, knowing that his time is short. Rev 12:7. In my opinion, with this symbolic story is meant that the fate of all the worlds of space is to expel evil from among its members, when the light of culture allows to eliminate those gaps where it is hidden. This does not mean that the evil beings that they will go to other worlds, but these beings would repent when he realized his mistake, and then evil would come out of them. So evil is only on the primitive worlds, but only temporarily until they reach the truth that prevents the existence of error, which is derived evil. Because evil is not really a being as such, but a psychological behavior that occurs when choosing the wrong path. Universal justice. Many people wonder if God is fair because it allows children born sick, or suffer accidents honest people. The reason for the confusion begins with the wrong definition that people have of God, believing that God is a being independent of the world and organizes it on a whim, but that interpretation is wrong. Everything looks differently when you realize that actually God we are all, in their successes, and errors we attribute to it, because in reality, we all have eternal life and all live every life and every situation, because everything in the universe is repeated and everything is renewed. It is unfortunate that a child is born sick, but it is wrong to say that it is an innocent victim of the divine plan, because the fact that the child is innocent does not mean it has not committed injustices in their previous lives. Therefore, the alleged innocence is not so, if raised in an absolute sense. Because actually all live all possible lives and all events, we will be a victim, but others will be executioners. Because universal justice works like a mirror, then it returns all the injustices who provokes, even if centuries after they caused. In the end, this God that some speak contemptuously and arrogantly actually part of ourselves. Therefore, we must understand God in their limitations, because the universe was made for the development of free will, and if we have the opportunity to make mistakes, we cannot understand what is responsibility. Before judging God must judge ourselves, because as Jesus who is without sin cast the first stone said. Actually God is only the set of laws that govern the universe, but those laws have been created by all living things that form including ourselves. What happens is that this does not remember because the reincarnated as men, we can only remember the facts of our limited human life, but not our spirit lived before. This is because in order to better live the adventure of existence as men, and the process of technological evolution, it is necessary not to mix both planes. Really we forget the facts of our past lives, to live life more intensely present. Because once man reaches its technological maturity, the level of progress of the universe and human were equalized, and then that period of darkness itself developing worlds only be a forgotten story. It is necessary to accept this great universal truth instead of complaining, and start using our creative capacity to make this a better world. The fact that there is universal justice, does not mean it has no sense of human justice, for universal justice only it refers to the fact that all possible events will be experienced by everyone, and therefore everything we do to others, sooner or later happen ourselves. Instead human justice does is act as a means of prevention, as to punish criminals causes the crimes diminish, helping to create a better world. In any case it is not true that accidents should always be attributed to a negligent behavior in a present or past life, because in a changing world and evolving, it is normal accidents, as these are the unintended consequence that has the fact forget, because when a cosmic cycle begins, the universe of a situation of total ignorance, that ignorance has the undesirable effect the existence of evil or accidents, but in return gives us the greatness of discovering the universe again in all its grandeur, as if we had never seen before, although in fact the repetition of the universe is indefinite and eternal. However, once our planet reaches its maximum level of technological and moral progress, it will be possible to completely eradicate evil and reduce to a minimum accidents or diseases. This is what every culture is defined as reaching to heaven or paradise. Because an evolved world is characterized by being illuminated by the light of wisdom, therefore, those behaviors as vanity or despotism may not exist in them, as they are derived from error and ignorance. For this reason, when the world ends its evolution, humanity rejected any violent behavior and will seek their happiness in science and peaceful life. The conclusion that can be obtained from the universal justice is that whatever we do to others someday we will live ourselves, therefore we must begin from this moment to consider the consequences of our own actions. Universal justice works as if they only existed a being in the universe, and all the lives we know, only represent our own past and our own future. Every life and every experience we will live in a different cosmic cycle. It is as if actually we represented a play, in which each new representation did a different role. Therefore, that work is universal life, will not end until we have lived the sum of all lives and all possible experiences. This is because at the beginning of the cosmic cycle there was only a single living being, then this being divided into the great vastness of beings that inhabit the space. Each being thus formed lives independent of other beings until this cosmic cycle ends, then all beings again be one, and when the universe starts again, the process will repeat identical, but living each being a different life lived previously, until every one of those beings live all of life and all the experiences, the sum of all beings, and then will be repeated time and everything starts from the beginning again. The fact that the universe repeat, does not mean that we have no free will, because what repeats is what we wanted to do voluntarily in the previous cosmic cycle, therefore the same events are repeated, but as a result of the repetition of weather. The Book of Seven Seals. And I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a book written inside and outside, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming, "Who is worthy to open the book and loose the seals?" And no one in heaven, nor in earth, neither under it, he could open the book, nor even set eyes on him. And I wept much because no one was found worthy to open the book or to set eyes on. Then he told me one of the elders, "Weep not. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed, so that open the book and its 7 seals." And I saw that in the midst before the throne and of the 4 living creatures and the elders stood a lamb as slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God on mission throughout the land. Who came and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. In my opinion, this moving tale of Apocalypse means that only those who are pure in heart are capable of understanding the great universal truths. Because only the righteous can see the demons that try to prevent the progress of humanity, they do not deceive them with lies. The Lamb therefore represents those who throughout the ages have fought to defend the truth and justice, and you will definitely get in the end triumph and expel evil and ignorance of the earth. Rev 5. My own experience. The truth is that very few people are dedicated to making a thorough analysis of the reality of the world around us, and when they do, mostly is aimed at a particular purpose and almost always professional work, but lack the freedom to study the world as a whole. People dedicated to their work most of their time and free time left usually dedicated to entertainment, what we could define as sensory or extroverted, i.e. entertainment in which little or no intellect involved. Because even those who spend a lot of time reading, what they do is increase their knowledge of what others have written, but you usually will not take time to consider whether what they have read is true, or find out if there is any conclusion undiscovered so far that can be deduced from what has been learned, and that in cases where scientific books have been read and not just novels, because novels, though entertaining, often lack scientific rigor. Instead, since my childhood, I was always prone to doubt everything, so, first try to improve my knowledge by learning a little of everything in terms of science, and then secondly try to use these scientific knowledge to try deducting all aspects of science, and the world did not have a satisfactory answer. Arguably, to go into this field passed to make a more proper task of a philosopher than a scientist, but this is only one point of view, because I understand the philosophy does not have to be considered less than any other branch the science. Because only philosophy can coordinate all aspects of knowledge in one and draw conclusions about it. The truth is that only the ability to doubt can provide us with the necessary will to enter into the search and find the truth about the world around us, but unfortunately, few people have the time and willingness to delve into that world unexplored, which it is meditation and philosophy. It is difficult to determine what causes a person to distance himself from the version of reality accepted by most. But I guess in my case, one possible trigger for this attitude would be made to feel disillusioned about things like teaching methods in schools, too dedicated to impose the official truth, seeking to instill political or management of schools rather than building capacity to seek truth for oneself and thereby our own mental freedom. I paid little attention to the school books, because rather than trying to encourage interest in culture, were designed to memorize what interested, why I got bad grades on tests, except in artistic expression and drawing, and out of school saved much money as possible to buy those books considered themselves truly dedicated, foster enthusiasm for science. The fact soon leave school gave me the opportunity to devote myself entirely to my own search, employing the most powerful tools that exist in the field of philosophy, which is to bring together scientific knowledge acquired deductive meditation. Let us not forget that the human brain is the most complex and least known machine there, and use that man makes it to the deductive analysis is very scarce. An example of this is in rigid definition of contemporary materialistic science makes what is life. It says that life is the result of the evolution of biological forms such as plants or animals, but denying the right to consider life the material from which these are derived biological forms. This represents a contradiction. It is a scientific absurd to say that a plant or an animal is alive, but not the material from which the animal is constituted. Scientists are determined to consider the reactions of material particles from a contemptuous view, analyzing only what happens in collisions between them or their chemical reactions, but never raised these particles as part of that living creature that is the universe, because to do so would have to change their attitude towards the true definition of life. It is precisely in this area where deductive analysis or philosophy has great value, helping to clarify these scientific gaps that official science refuses to consider. The best thing about philosophy is the ability it gives us to travel to any time and space and deduct everything that falls to man and the universe, using the best computer that exists as our own brain. Because science does not progress only by collecting technical data, it is also necessary to analyze in detail the facts, to draw useful conclusions from these findings. Therefore, philosophy, unlike classical science, what it does is to unite all science on one thing, to have a global view of all, to help us better understand the world around us. Epilogue. It is true that in my books often repeat the same arguments, but when I see too many people who only care about vain entertainment, without devoting little time to reflect and seek the truth, it gives me the motivation to insist on desire to awaken their consciences. Many people do not understand that meditation can make our lives more enjoyable, allowing us to better understand the world around us. Like everyone else, I make mistakes, but at least have the excuse of seeking truth honestly. It is true that my books are mostly an exercise in deduction and meditation rather than technical analysis, but that is precisely the philosophy that in the deductions we do with our minds, based on the knowledge acquired. The ideas and conclusions expressed in my books are the result of many years engaged in research, and many have scientific data taken into account, and that helped me to get close as possible to the truth. It is also true that one should not make the mistake of underestimating a book to be mainly the result of deductive meditation, for without such meditation would not have been possible many of the discoveries that we know today. It is true that the world is full of pseudo-scientific untalented writers who only seek to make money telling lies, and that disguise their ignorance with extensive travels around the world to try to pretend they do not have a culture and make more credible their claims. Instead, I offer my books for free to whoever wants to read, being my only interest of the common good and progress of humanity. In my books, I do not usually have much regard spelling rules. It is true that in part are errors, but also partly differences are deliberate. Therefore, I find contemptible those who judge people based only on superfluities, not bothering to analyze the details. It is a serious mistake to stubbornly keep the rules, because with the changing times and ideas, those things that we consider immutable truths, tomorrow will be considered mistakes. Therefore, it is necessary to awaken our creative capacity, starting to doubt everything, because the only way the world can evolve. Because if we are willing to acknowledge our mistakes, first to feel the discomfort of uncertainty, but then the satisfaction of feeling stronger, to be closer to the truth. My books are usually brief, yet intense. Therefore I considered more appropriate to divide them into short readings, for easier understanding. I think you are mistaken who measured a book by its size, because what really matters is the value of its contents. Sometimes dedication to philosophy absorbs a person completely, preventing the natural desire to have a partner or a family, but for a philosopher his wife is philosophy and his books are his children, and try these grow up with the same enthusiasm as a father would his children. Finish.